Hello, world. A very, very good afternoon. Namaste and Nisam Bulavinaka from Sydney, Australia. I am Sashi Singh, and welcome to Sashi Singh's Talking Point. Today is a little milestone for Sashi Singh's Talking Point as we reach double figures. Yes, indeed. Today is our 10th episode of the SSTP program. The success of the program is totally on the basis of the support and response from you, the viewers. In just a short span of 9 programs that have gone to air so far, we created another little milestone this week when figures revealed by Facebook showed that we have this week achieved over 52.6K post reach. Now, that in anyone's book, are great, great figures. So, thank you, viewers, for being with us right from episode 1. Really enjoy your continued support. It just makes our effort all the more worthwhile in putting the hard work to produce and present Sashi Singh's Talking Point and bringing the program into your living rooms. In today's program, we will shortly be joined by Mr. Richard Naidu, renowned Fiji lawyer. Those of you who have followed Richard Naidu's newspaper column or his Facebook posts know that he's not afraid to call a spade a spade. I am really looking forward to our chief guest joining me in a short while from now. As we begin, may I please request, as always, if you could please share the SSTP page on your own timelines so that we may share the interview with Mr. Richard Naidu with as many friends and family members as possible. To ensure that you receive instant notifications of all future programs, please like the SSTP page and press the follow button so you'll never miss out on what's happening on SSTP. So welcome again to those that have joined us. Welcome to the Thinking People's program, Sashi Singh's Talking Point, live on Facebook. And I'd just like to acknowledge someone is watching from Japan, and konnichiwa indeed to Leone Ngukirewa Karawalevu. Konnichiwa to you, my friend from Japan. Welcome to Sashi Singh's Talking Point this morning. As we've done in the last few weeks, we begin episode 10 of SSTP with a warm welcome to our regular contributor, former Fiji TV journalist Nikhil Singh, to tell us the key happenings of the political week in Fiji and in Australia. Nikhil, welcome to episode 10 and a very good afternoon to you.
Indeed, a really great milestone for SSTP. Sashi, good afternoon to you.
Thank you very much, Nikhil. Now, questions on whether Fijians have the right to protest have surfaced yet again, with the arrest of a citizen just a couple of days ago. A video recording of the arrest has gone viral on social media. What led to the arrest?
Well, Sashi, this is identical to the scenario faced by some 30 workers of the Water Authority of Fiji who had gathered at their union's office premises to protest in 2019. They were arrested and charged with unlawful assembly. On Friday, Manua Malani was arrested for allegedly holding a protest with his wife and a few others at their residence, a private property in Flagstaff, Suva. The video recording that you referenced of this arrest shows several police officers arriving at the residence to arrest Mr. Malani. As I understand, Sashi, Manua Malani is still in custody, taken in on Friday. No charges have been laid. And we have been informed that Mr. Malani is on a hunger strike. The Malanis had earlier applied to hold a protest march, but their application was declined by the authorities. This doesn't come as a surprise to us, Sashi, as in the episode last week, the General Secretary of the Fiji Trade Union Congress mentioned that they had made several applications which not only came back declined, but no reasons were given for the rejection. Sashi, the right to freedom of assembly and the right to peaceful protest is a fundamental democratic right. But if one looks at the actions of the authorities in recent years, it does raise a question. What is more interesting or disappointing is that we haven't heard anything from the Fiji Human Rights Commission as yet. So we'll be following developments on this matter, Sashi.
And Nikhil, you can bet your bottom dollar that I'll be raising issues of constitutional rights with our legal expert, Mr. Richard Naidu, during our main program this afternoon. Now, I believe another court challenge has been mounted against the Bainimarama government over changes to the Electoral Act. What can you tell us about this?
The Asia Pacific report tells us that 7 women are challenging the requirement that citizens must only use their name on their birth certificates for voting and other official purposes, including for official identification documents. They have filed a constitutional redress against the Attorney General and the Supervisor of Elections, challenging changes passed by Parliament last year to the Electoral Act, which deals with registration of voters, and the Deportation Act. The 7 are former government minister, a media personality, Bernadette Rounds Ganilau, politicians Priscilla Singh and Seni Nambo, teacher and community worker Andi Davila Tongnivalu, unionists Dr. Elizabeth Reed Fong and Salote Ngalo, and Yasmin Nisha Khan. Under the new laws, people who wish to use their married name or adopted names for the purposes I mentioned earlier must formally change their name on their birth certificates. In their action, the applicants say they believe the new laws have a disproportionate and adverse impact upon married women compared with other groups. An estimated 100,000 women are believed to be affected by the law. Sashi, the matter has been heard, and it was before Chief Justice Kamal Kumar, and a judgment will be delivered on notice.
All right, moving closer to home, the attack by Russia on Ukraine has dominated the news. What has Australia's response been?
Well, The Guardian reports the latest that Australia plans to join its allies in personally sanctioning the Russian President Putin and the Russian Foreign Affairs Minister over the full scale invasion of Ukraine, but says it will not expel Russian diplomats from the country at this stage. The government flagged the move amid growing fears of an all out Russian invasion and assault on Ukraine's capital, Kiev. And as Russia used its veto power to block a UN Security Council resolution deploring the invasion. Um, the Australian Foreign Affairs Minister, Marise Payne, said she was taking advice from a department on expanding sanctions to include the Russian president, who would, she said, be personally responsible for the deaths and the suffering of innocent Ukrainians. The minister said while sanctioning a country's leader was an exceptional step, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was an exceptional situation.
And Nikhil, finally, a decision to cancel all train services in New South Wales earlier this week left thousands of commuters stranded. The New South Wales government pointed the finger at the rail union's industrial action for the chaos. What was this case?
Well, Transport for New South Wales cancelled trains on Monday, claiming it was impossible to safely operate services with union bans in place affecting rosters. The New South Wales Premier, Dominic Perrottet, blamed the union for the shutdown, saying it was part of a coordinated attack on the government by the union and Labor. But Sashi, the Rail Transport Bus Union New South Wales leader, Alex Classens, insisted rail workers were not on strike and were ready to get trains back moving at a minute's notice. And he said, I quote, to deliberately shut down the rail network on such a big day for many people, seemingly so they can run a fear campaign about unions, is quite extraordinary. What we've learned is Fair Work Commission documents tabled in New South Wales Parliament revealed Sydney Trains had been, in fact, preparing to shut down the network from early as Thursday, 4 days before Monday's chaos. So the bureaucrats made the call to shut down operations and then conveniently shifted the blame onto the union.
Nikhil Singh, once again, thank you very much for your contribution this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you next week. Have a safe and blessed week, Nikhil.
Likewise, Shashi, thank you.
Thank you very much. You are watching Sashi Singh's Talking Point on Facebook Live. We ask the questions that Fijians all over the world want answers to, Fijians want to know. Now it's time to meet our chief guest. Our chief guest is well-renowned Fiji lawyer. He's a partner with the Munro Lees firm. Let me introduce our chief guest first. And let me say, I've had introductions and I've had introductions, and this is one introduction. Richard Naidu grew up on his father's dairy farm in Delanevesi. His mother was a school teacher. He went to Vayutu Primary School and Suva Grammar School. His last 2 years of secondary school were on a European Union scholarship at a school in Wales. This school was in a castle, so this makes him like Harry Potter, or if you don't like him, maybe Voldemort. Richard's first job was at the Fiji Times as a journalist. He continued to work for the Fiji Times while he was studying accountancy and law at the University of Auckland. This was his attempt to magically look like he was in two countries at the same time. He took a year off studies in 1987 to work for the Fiji Times. Then he got caught up in Sitiveni Rambuka's coup, working for Dr. Mavandra's deposed government. One way or the other, he has ended up embroiled in all of Fiji's coups, always on the losing side. Richard returned to New Zealand in 1988 to work for a newspaper in Auckland. The newspaper went bust, so he finally accepted that he would have to be a lawyer. He worked as a litigation lawyer in two large firms in Auckland before returning to Fiji in 1995 to join Munro Lees. He became a partner of Munro Lees in 2000, just in time for the next coup. Richard practices many different types of law at Munro Lees, including competition, banking and finance, foreign investment, media, real property, and taxation. He is also a mediator accredited by the Australian Centre for Dispute Assessment and Resolution. Richard is an occasional presenter and commentator on legal, media, and other public issues in Fiji. Over the years, he has worked for or in a number of different NGOs, including the Bailey Trust, Fiji Red Cross Society, Fasanok, and the Fiji Law Society. He is currently a board member of FRIEND and has a committee position on the International Bar Association, an international organization for lawyers. Richard has one wife, 3 children, 2 dogs, 2 pairs of running shoes, 2 tennis rackets, and 1 Twitter account. He is now trying to catch up to John Apted on Facebook. He also has a 16-year-old Nissan Pathfinder that every new car salesperson in Suva is begging him to trade in. Richard's main ambition in life, though, is to beat Fiji's famous veteran runner Shirichand Mushroom in the Suva Half Marathon. However, even though Mushroom is now 69 years old, Mushroom is still faster than Richard around the course. And good luck to you, Shirichand Mushroom. Quite a noteworthy resume to have, I must say. Like him or loathe him, he is the man who is not afraid to mince his word. And this afternoon, on a one-to-one interview with Mr. Richard Naidu, we will discuss some key issues of the 2013 Constitution, use of legislative powers in Parliament, and a lot more to talk about. Now it's my pleasure to welcome on Sashi Singh's Talking Point this afternoon my chief guest, Mr. Richard Naidu. Good afternoon. Welcome. Namaste. Nisam Bulavinaka to you, Richard.
Bula Sashi, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you all right. Thank you very much for being part of the show, and thanks for accepting the invitation to be my chief guest this afternoon. Now, what a resume. When is this race happening with Shurichand Mushroom, the half marathon?
It happens once a year. Unless we have COVID restrictions. But in fact, Mushroom, who's a guy, so many of us know, Munro Lees is a sponsor of the Suva Half Marathon, the marathon club in Suva. And so we always ask Mushroom to come and run for us as part of our team. And so we sponsor him to join us. And boy, I tell you, 69 years old and he's still going strong. And as I say, I'm 11 years younger than him, and I still can't beat him. Really admire the man. He's stayed fit. He's still a legend.
He is indeed a legend, and of course, I've known Mushroom for a long, long time from Lautoka. I originally hail from Lautoka, and all Lautokans will know Mushroom running the streets up and down hill and dale. And recently, I've seen his photographs as well, still looking very, very trim, fit, and proper. Let's go, Mushroom! And nice of you guys to sponsor him. All
Yeah,
right,
well,
let me.
that's the only way to get him there so I can beat him. Haven't succeeded yet.
Right. Well, let's begin by me asking you, what is one of your earliest memories?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was raised, as you introduced me, I was raised on a dairy farm in Delnavesi. So I guess my earliest memories are on the farm. I am actually, people find it hard to believe now, but I am actually a farm kid. I'm quite comfortable with getting my hands dirty and all of the things that life on a farm involves.
Okay. And who would you say was most influential in young Richard Naidu's life?
Ha. Well, it's got to be your parents, I think. When you're a farm kid, particularly dairy farmers, you are working 365 days a year. Cows do not take a day off. You have to milk them every single day. So whether you like it or not, you're around your family all the time. You don't have neighbors when you're a farmer.
Hmm.
You don't sort of have people's houses that you just cross the fence and go into. So your family is very important, and you become very used to, I think, being just part of a very small, close family unit. And I think many farming families understand this. They know this. You don't have a social life. You don't have a weekend. So much of your time is spent working on the farm because farms don't wait.
Well, absolutely right. I've had the pleasure of working in a dairy milking farm in South Auckland. And like you say, it's a full time 365-day job, and the cows don't wait. It's all
Yeah.
time precision. I must mention and pay tribute to your dear departed mother, Mrs. Ethel Naidu. Your mum, and I think you know this, she was a constant source of encouragement during my days as a broadcaster at the old Fiji Broadcasting Commission. She would often phone through and give her point of view on my broadcasts, and then that was something that I always was thankful for, and I remember your mum quite fondly, Richard.
I didn't know that, but I
Yeah.
don't find that surprising at all.
Well, yeah, she was a wonderful lady, and like I said, a source of inspiration, and in another way, kept me on my toes as well, because you get told by somebody quite senior, and then you know that the advice has to be well taken and it's well meant. So I always cherish that, and I thought I'd mention that to you this morning.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I think that's the key. If you get advice or criticism, being able to take it and use it and improve. I think that's a really valuable skill by itself, which I'm sure we'll get to that. But some of us are better at doing than others.
All right. Now, you are a leading lawyer in Fiji, a journalist, human rights activist, and an expert on constitutional matters. This sort of puts you in a rarefied company. Like I said in my introduction, like you or loathe you, it really does not matter because you call things like you see it. Where did you inherit this value from? Calling a spade, so to say, the ability to speak openly, even in adverse situations.
Um, I don't know that it's necessarily a special skill or a superpower. I think it's just some people feel the need more strongly than others. I think that view is in most of us. Some of us just have more of a passion for it than others. One thing I should say is that I'm not actually a constitutional lawyer. I'm not actually a very good public lawyer. I'm actually a very boring old commercial lawyer who tries to understand public law and the Constitution. And I make that point, Sashi, because it's really important for us, even those of us who are not lawyers, to take a common sense view of the law and of constitutions and rules and good governance. We don't have to be in awe of the law. We should always ask critical questions. We should always ask simple questions. You know what they say, always ask a dumb question. Because if something doesn't look right or doesn't feel right, it's really important that we are not made to feel stupid because we're not lawyers, or we're not constitutional law experts, or we're not human rights lawyers. This stuff ought to be common sense. It ought to make sense to people without legal qualifications, people without qualifications at all. Because if we can't understand the Constitution and if we can't understand the rules under which we live, then there's something wrong with those rules. So, to answer your other question, I talked about my Harry Potter castle school, and it's interesting, how influential it was for me to go to the UK and spend time in Europe. And I was in this college with friends from 60 different countries, and it taught me a few things. The first thing I learned was that even though I had been, top of my class and regarded as a smart kid in Fiji, and in my exams in Fiji and in my schools in Fiji, as soon as I got over there and I was thrown into this pressure cooker with some very, very smart young people, I realized very fast that I was no great shakes at all. I was a very average sort of student compared to most of my peers. We're all scholarship students, but I got an international outlook on life very early. These people who I went to school with, who are still my friends, I mean, it's interesting. We are in touch with each other on WhatsApp and Viber every day. I mean, things like the crisis in Ukraine, that's a live issue, for us. So having that perspective, having that international perspective, and having, from a young age, being able to watch well-developed countries at work, countries in, like the UK, like countries in Europe, and you begin to ask yourself, well, why can't our country be like that? Why can't our country make decisions like that? Why can't our country have good government like that? And of course, freedom of speech, criticizing the government, holding the government to account, demanding that it be transparent. Those are all things that are just an essential part of good governance. And so I guess I was luckier than many people, because I got to see that in action, at a very early stage in my life.
And
So
that
I don't know, a very long
experience,
answer to your question, but
that kind of experience sort of broadens one's horizon, definitely. Now, in the past, I mean, as you mentioned a moment ago, people should not be afraid to ask questions, and it's a common sense approach, as you say, and one necessarily does not have to be a lawyer. Now, in the past, you've got into trouble for speaking out. Let me ask you, why is there a need for Richard Naidu to speak out? Is this the same qualities that you just spoke about? The need to question?
um, it's just yesterday, I tweeted a picture of this young woman on the streets of Moscow being arrested because she was demonstrating against Putin's invasion. And she's demonstrating against her own government, her own leader. And she's being arrested and she's being taken away. And she's smiling. And there was a comment on Facebook, why is she smiling? She's being arrested. She's being taken away. And I thought about that. And in some ways, I reflected on it and I said, well, perhaps she thinks she's actually living her best life. She's actually speaking up for herself. She's being strong. She's being committed. She believes in her own opinions. She's not just being herded around like a sheep. She's not just being bossed around and ordered around. And I think for all of us, the ability to express our own views and speak our minds is important. And I think that burden often falls on people who have a little bit more education and a little bit more money than others, because we're the people who are able to resist the pressure that a lot of other people feel. And people who feel a little bit reluctant to speak out because they feel that somebody else is going to make fun of them because they have superior knowledge, or who feel that they're going to be told, don't speak up or you'll get into trouble, you'll lose your job. So I think those of us who are, a little bit older, a little bit more financially secure, those of us who have a bit of a background and are actually able to speak up about things that seem to be complicated to other people, I think we've got a special duty to, speak up and give everybody our points of view.
Now, that's very well answered. You were one of the very few from the legal fraternity that strongly criticized the Republic of Fiji military forces, which seized power in the military coup of 5th December 2006. It was reported that you call the coup, and I quote, a serious crime against the state, end of quote. Reports also suggested that you predicted that the military might abrogate the Constitution, saying, the military also seems determined to impose its will on the country by force, so inevitably, I think it will end up abrogating the Constitution and starting again. What led you to condemn the military coup in such strong terms?
Well, by 2006, we'd had 19 years of this. A coup can never be the right way to resolve political differences. And, I think this is a theme that I want to come back to maybe a little bit, because I think it reflects the situation that we're in right now. Rule of law, good governance, all of those things requires checks and balances. It requires you to be part of a system, and it requires you to be part of a system in which you don't always win. In a balanced system, it's no different from, Super Rugby. If the system is balanced, if you have good competitors, there's some and you lose some. And it's up to you to be your very best in order to win. And if you're not your very best, somebody else will win. It's when you say, I am bigger than the system. I am more important than the system. So therefore, I can do anything I want. That's when you get a breakdown. When you have people who say, the system is less important than I am, and forget about the checks and balances, because my view is more important and what I say is more important. That's when the breakdown of things begins, because you no longer have an equal playing field. You no longer have a system in which everybody can participate, and that can lead to a whole lot of different outcomes. So what you end up with is, first of all, you don't get the best outcomes because not everybody is contributing. The people who dissent, the people who differ, they're not allowed to set across their point of view, even if they have the better ideas. But then things get worse because sooner or later people become frustrated and they become angry that they are not allowed to participate. And that's when you get turmoil, and that's when you get dissatisfaction and eventually social breakdown. And that's when you get riots in the streets and disorder. And we see that everywhere around the world with dictatorial governments. And that's why a system of checks and balances, a system that we all respect, is so important. And why we've got to understand that in that system, we're going to win some and we're going to lose some. And when we lose, we've got to accept that. We've got to accept that that's part of the rules. And, pick up and start again.
Let me tell you, this afternoon, while I have the privilege of having you on the SSTP show, we will be discussing governance, transparency, and a number of things, including Parliament and a whole lot of other topics. But still staying around that 2006 theme very briefly, it was just after Christmas of 2006, on December 26th, on Boxing Day, you condemned the physical abuse allegedly meted out to 6 pro democracy activists who were summoned to the Queen Elizabeth barracks in Nambua at around midnight. And you said that such abuse was unlawful and unacceptable. And I applaud you for those statements. Now, you called on the Fiji Human Rights Commission to take a stand against such violations. In light of what had transpired, with regards to the arrests, why were you critical of the Fiji Human Rights Commission then?
Well, from memory, Sachin, it's a long time ago, but from memory, the Human Rights Commission at that point was just hand in glove with the coup. They actually supported it. They had taken the view that the previous government was racist and corrupt and, all of the things that formed part of the narrative to justify the coup. So, how can you, if you are the Human Rights Commission, support actions which, first of all, mete out violence to others, which is you can't get a more basic breach of human rights, but which also, for the reasons I was talking about before, when you take away a constitution, when you take away a system of government which has all the checks and balances that are supposed to be there, when you take that away, you're taking away people's basic human rights. Their rights to access to independent courts for redress, their rights to speak, their rights to assemble, their rights to have their own elected representatives in charge. All of those things are being taken away. So how can you, if you are a Human Rights Commission and you're supporting the exact opposite of that, say you're doing your job?
And I guess that is on the basis of what you've just said, that would have led you to describe the Human Rights Commission report as mostly laughable when that report did come out.
Sounds like me. Yeah. I can't remember saying it.
All right. Now, I've just been sort of unpacking who Richard Naidu is in terms of your bold statements when people face adversity in life. However, it comes at a cost. I believe just a few weeks after your statements regarding the 6 pro activists, you were taken in and you were taken into the barracks yourself. You were allegedly warned about making insightful remarks. Without incurring the wrath of any authority today, are you in a position to talk about this incident?
Oh, you're welcome to ask. I mean, yes.
Okay. Well, what really happened at the military barracks when you were taken in? Were you just warned, or were you interrogated and beaten?
I was more than warned. I was restrained. I suffered a few whacks here and there. Nothing as bad as the people on the 26th of December. Um, so it wasn't pleasant. The It was, I guess, just the stock standard 3 hours of treatment that most people went through, at that time, um, who were dissenting against the government, um, but certainly not as bad as the 26th December 6.
Okay. Now, the RFMF statement by Major Naomi Leweni at that time stated that you had breached the Public Order Act and the State Emergency Decree. What was your take on this? Did the Public Order Act mean that a person could not criticize, I guess, the rape of democracy in Fiji?
Yeah, I mean, the Public Order Act is one of those old chestnuts that gets rolled out regularly. I mean, even now. And the Public Order Act is a law that it's a strange law in many ways, but probably necessary if used correctly, which criminalizes spreading public disorder or alarm or panic. And even now, it seems that people can be accused of breaching the Public Order Act simply by saying something that the government doesn't like. And the government then says, oh, well, you're spreading alarm, you're causing panic, you're causing disruption, which of course is ridiculous. I mean, one person expressing a viewpoint is not going to bring everybody out on the streets. So nothing new there, I guess.
Okay.
Not then,
Now,
not now.
okay. And have there been other instances where you've been taken in for questioning by the military, whether you've been roughed up?
I don't think I've been taken in since 2007 by the military, from memory. I had a couple of brushes with the police,
Mm-hmm.
but no, nothing. I mean, still unlawful, still unconstitutional, but that's not to say, Sashi. We still have some serious issues with young people, particularly young Itoke men,
Mm-hmm.
who are taken into police custody and don't come out alive. We had a recent case, I think, just about a month ago.
Yes.
And some of us, again, because of our position and our profile, we possibly have a degree of protection, because if something were to be done to us, there would be publicity and there would be condemnation, and the thing would cross borders and become international. But for people who don't have that sort of profile and don't have access to, NGOs or publicity, or don't have a profile, they can still suffer, obviously, what is happening in there, some serious consequences, and it seems, serious violence. So this is it's a really important issue, and clearly not enough is being done when some people are taken into custody, and clearly things do not end well for them.
Okay. You are watching Sashi Singh's Talking Point, the Thinking People's program. Please share this page with family and friends if you can. Our chief guest today is Mr. Richard Naidu. Now, Richard, let me discuss the subject of democracy, a reality or farce in Fiji. In early October 2021, my good friend, your lawyer colleague, Graham Everett Leong, together with the former Secretary General of the Fiji Parliament, Ms. Mary Chapman, co-authored an article, "Is Fiji Still a Democracy?" The article started off by saying that democracy takes different forms, but all draw on the principle of government of the people, by the people, for the people. The people are at the center. That's what the article said. Now, Richard, in today's Fiji, do people really have the freedom and rights as enshrined in the Constitution? What's the reality?
Well, the first problem is the Constitution, Sashi. It appears to be a democratic constitution, but the first principle of a democratic constitution is that the people have enacted it, or the people's representatives have enacted it. And of course, this is a constitution that nobody enacted. It was really put to us without any consultation, without anybody voting for it or supporting it. It's one of my standard jokes when I'm talking about the Constitution, that the document begins, "We, the people, give ourselves this Constitution." And I said, I think there's a misprint there. I think it's "we, two people, give ourselves this Constitution." But so your first problem is that it wasn't democratically enacted. Nobody voted for it. Nobody voted for this system of government that we have. Nobody voted for this system of elections, the parliament we have, the fact that we don't have an upper house of parliament, a whole lot of things. Then, under the Constitution, which the government keeps telling us is a world beater, one of the most democratic constitutions in the world, we have some very strange things in it. The first is that we have a Bill of Rights, like every constitution has, and those Bill of Rights give us rights to life and liberty and freedom of expression and freedom of association and all of those good things. Ordinarily, in a constitution, the Bill of Rights is supreme. So it is the most important part of the Constitution. So any law that Parliament passes that is in breach of that Bill of Rights can be struck down as unconstitutional. And interestingly, that's one of the things that Nikhil talked about, early on in this case of the 7 women who are challenging this latest law, and they're attempting to challenge that as a breach of the Bill of Rights. But our Constitution says that the Bill of Rights gives way to any military decree that was passed before it, between 2006 and 2014. So if there was any law that was passed by decree in that time, and if we try to say that that Bill of Rights that law is unconstitutional because of our current Bill of Rights, the law says, no, you can't. The decree is more important. So if you think about laws like the media decree, for example, which we would say has many, many parts that breach freedom of speech or ordinary guarantees of freedom of speech, we can't touch that. There were various labor laws around that were decreed that, again, we couldn't touch, although some of those laws have since been reformed. If you go to the very back of the Constitution, you will find a provision, 1734D, I think, for anybody who's legally minded. And in our Constitution, there are whole areas where the courts can't go, where you cannot challenge various laws as being unconstitutional, or you can't even challenge any decisions made under those laws. So any law that was made between 2006 2014, if a decision is made under any of those laws, even today, we can't challenge those decisions. Now, in order to have democracy, we all think about democracy as something where everybody votes and the majority wins, and that's democracy, and isn't it great? But that's not actually what democracy is, because democracy on its own needs to be underpinned by something else, which is called rule of law. Democracy, which is governed by the majority, is not much good for you if you are in the minority, because it means that the majority can always ride roughshod over you and your rights and your entitlement to equal treatment. And that's what the law gives you. That's what rule of law gives you, because rule is, okay, fine, majority can rule, and good for you, because the majority ought to be able to say how the country is run and how things work. But the majority cannot make decisions that restrict the rights of people in the minority. And those minorities are all kinds of things. You can have an ethnic minority. You can have a minority in terms of, things like language, sexual orientation, all of these sorts of things where the law is necessary to restrain the majority from making rules which treat the minority, unequally. So you can talk about democracy, and that's all fine, but you've also got to have rule of law. Now, and sorry, this is a very long answer to your question, but rule of law means that everybody is accountable to the law. Everybody is accountable to the courts. And when you've got a constitution that says there's a whole swathe of places where you can't go, you can't challenge government decisions through the courts, you don't have rule of law. And if you don't have rule of law, you don't have a sound democratic system. Now, that's just the Constitution. Then we've got to talk about how the Constitution is actually enacted, because you have the theory and you have the practice. And some of the things that Graham and Mary were talking about, in terms of how Parliament behaves, how the government behaves, are the sorts of things that lead us to question whether we really do have a democracy or not.
And those questions will be asked this afternoon in a number of different scenarios, Richard. Let us explore this in a little more detail. Section 18 of the Fiji Constitution is on freedom of assembly. It says every person has the right, peaceably and unarmed, to assemble, demonstrate, picket, and present petitions. Yet we have a situation in Fiji. For example, last week we were advised the Fiji Trades Union Congress, for example, had 5 or 6 applications for permits to peacefully march, denied with no reasons provided. Now, is this not a denial of the union delegates and their members' fundamental rights?
Well, yeah, and that's basic, isn't it? And this has
Absolutely.
been the case for years. And there are two pieces to this, right? The first is that you ought to have a right to assemble, to protest, to wave your placards, do all of those things without the need for a police permit. The only reason you need a police permit is if you're going to get in the way of other people.
Yep.
If you're going to march down a street, or you're going to disrupt traffic, or block the footpath or something like that, because then you are infringing the rights of others. And at that point, the police have to say, well, what's fair? What's reasonable? You've got a right to protest, and I'll give you the right to block half the road for 3 hours so that you can do that, because I'm balancing your right to express yourself against the rights of other people who are going to be inconvenienced. Right? Now, in a well-functioning society, and you'll know this in Australia and New Zealand and many other places, it's not difficult to avail yourself of that right. It's not difficult to ask the authorities for permission to have a march, stage a protest, gather in a particular place, because the authorities respect your right to express yourself. They respect your right to speak up and make your point of view known. But in our country, the authorities just seem to say, no, we're not going to let you express any viewpoint that differs from our point of view. You are not allowed to express yourself in any way that differs, with the view of the government. And so you have to ask yourself, is that how a democratic country works? Is that how a country that respects freedom of assembly works? Is that how a country that respects freedom of speech works? And yet all of those rights are supposed to be rights that are respected in our Constitution.
Well, you just mentioned freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, expression, and publication is also enshrined in the Constitution at Section 17. Despite this, do you find that people in Fiji, including those in positions of power and influence, that they're too afraid to express themselves?
Yeah, it seems to be a bit of a disease right now. And we do have a very pliant group of people, including, those in authority. And I guess there are a number of reasons for that.
Okay. You would have heard Nikhil speak earlier on this afternoon. There's a current matter, the Malani arrest 2 days back. I believe that the background was that after they applied for a permit to march, the permit was denied, and the Malanis protested in their backyard. And I believe, allegedly, that protest was against the Attorney General. Now, looking at this example from a constitutional viewpoint, is a man's home not his castle where he can protest as much as he wants? Or simply put, in today's Fiji, it's a big no-no.
Essentially, I don't know, I must confess, I don't know much about the case. I should know more. And part of that is perhaps because it hasn't really been reported on mainstream media. I did try to find out a little bit of it on social media. Obviously, the Malanis have a court case going with the government. They've also been dealt with, I think, for contempt of court. And there's some background to that I'm not familiar with. But all of those things aside, I agree with you. If you can't protest in your own backyard, where else can you protest? And, equally, there should be no reason why you cannot walk down a footpath carrying a placard saying what you want to say. Some years ago, I think there was a young man who did just that. He walked down the street, with I think he was wearing a sandwich board, and it was some sort of protest message, and he was arrested. There's no reason to arrest people, or they're not inconveniencing anybody else. They're not a disturbance or a hindrance to anybody else. So why are they being dealt with like that? Simply because they're expressing an opinion.
All right, now, in terms of, I call it the culture of fear. Is there a culture of fear amongst the general population to speak openly and freely in Fiji? And if so, what is the fear?
I think if you look at undemocratic societies around the world, and let me be reasonable here. Let me be fair here. There are many degrees of dictatorship, of undemocratic government, repression, etc. And I'm not saying that Fiji is like North Korea. I'm not saying Fiji is like Afghanistan under the Taliban. There are many countries where that are much less democratic even than Fiji. But that's not an excuse, because in Fiji we could do so much better than we are doing from the viewpoint of democracy and human rights. Okay, so when I speak about a lack of democracy and a lack of human rights, I'm not trying to say that this is the worst and most undemocratic country in the world. What I am saying, though, is that in terms of democracy and human rights, we should be doing so much better than we're doing. All right, so just having started that way. The problem with undemocratic countries, and Fiji is in that category, undemocratic, is that you begin by imposing fear, and then that culture of fear, it just takes hold. It just becomes a matter of habit, and you've almost forgotten sometimes why you're afraid to speak up. So way back in the day, and you still hear it every so often, people used to say, oh, I can't speak out because I will be taken to the barracks. I will be taken to the army camp. I will be dealt with up there, and I'm afraid of that. And even now, you hear people say that, more jokingly than anything. But of course, that's where it starts. And so people just develop this culture of fear more as a habit than anything. They've actually forgotten that they should have and they should use the right to speak up. But it then becomes a bit more subtle than that, because then people become afraid for their jobs. So if you have a public sector position, whether you're in the government or whether you're in a statutory organization or whether you're in a large private company that does a lot of business with government, you will come under pressure not to speak up against the government. So your employment is at risk. And if you think about this, for so many people, it's very easy for us to say, this person should speak up, that person should speak up. They should, take a stand against the government or whatever. But everybody have got families, they've got mortgages, they've got, financial commitments that they have to meet. And it's when you put their employment in jeopardy or you put their small businesses in jeopardy, people find it hard to speak up at that time. They find it hard to put themselves in the firing line. And so, I'm sympathetic to people in that position. I'm not so sympathetic to people who have the money, who have the ability to withstand criticism, who can lose a few government contracts and not feel it. I'm not sympathetic to those people who refuse to speak up and refuse to, to talk about what's wrong. But I do understand for others that it's not easy because so much pressure is put on them in so many different ways.
Okay, now let us look at some of the current government's actions or activities over the past few years with a view to establish whether the due process of law has and is being followed. I like the way you started today's talk. You mentioned the due process of law. When the military coup was carried out in December 2006, shortly afterwards, Bainimarama said, and he made a loud and bold statement, that the military, was going to get rid of corruption in Fiji. And for many years, there was a military regime that ran the country. Then we had the Fiji Independent Commission Against Corruption, FICAC, established. And it began its operations, I believe, in April 2007. A long time has lapsed since then. In fact, FICAC, I believe, have legislative powers equal to the police. In your opinion, has FICAC exposed any major corruption cases, or it has just done the current government's bidding and gone after its detractors?
I'd have to say, Sashi, I'm on the latter side of that argument.
Mm-hmm.
This whole business about corruption, and again, if you look around the world and you look at when armies take over governments, the first thing they will say is that the government that we are overthrowing was corrupt. It was necessary to get rid of it because it was corrupt. That's just the standard military line every time there's a coup.
Mm.
Watch it on BBC News every single
Yes.
time, right? Fiji was never openly or endemically corrupt. Not under the previous government, not under governments before that. Is that to say we were squeaky clean? Of course not. There was corruption then. There is corruption now. So I have to say, for those of us who play by the book, and certainly my firm, Munro Lees, we play very much by the book. Nobody gets a bribe. Nobody gets a $2 grease payment. Nobody gets anything. And so when people know the way we play, we never get asked for bribes. We never get asked for grease payments. So it's actually quite hard for us to know, to what extent there really is corruption in the public service or corruption anywhere else. We've never put a brown bag in the hands of any public official. And so there's no public official who's ever asked us for one. So I don't think that corruption was a major problem before 2006. Certainly not the problem it was made out to be. I'm sure that there was corruption then. And as I said, I'm sure there's corruption now. I don't think FICAC has made a significant difference. If you think about the big trials where FICAC has been involved, you think of Mr. Garase, you think of Mahendra Patel, you think of, I know about Kenny Dakundraketi's trial. These were not cases of major corruption. In fact, if you looked at the facts, they were, pretty laughable in terms of the crimes of which these were committed, were accused. So I'd have to say, and I think FICAC possibly has gone after, some poor little civil servant, yes, who did accept a string of fish in return for giving somebody a building permit, or something like that. But that's the sort of petty corruption that we've always seen. And as I say, no different then, no different now. Yes, has FICAC made a difference? I don't think so.
All right. Still looking at the due process of law and the actions of government, let us look at the USP debacle. The Fiji government is presently at loggerheads with the University of the South Pacific. Up to the end of December 2021, the Fijian government owed USP $63.1 million in unpaid contributions as it continues to demand an investigation into allegations of mismanagement and abuse by its Vice Chancellor, Professor Paul Aluwalia. Now, insofar as these allegations are concerned, as you know, the University Council has stated that there is no case to answer. Firstly, do you think the government arm is going over and beyond its powers to interfere with the USP management?
I think that goes without saying, Sashi, right?
Good.
And I think it's actually a bigger problem than that. And it's a problem that will really damage Fiji. Since the 1970s, Fiji has been regarded, and luckily we're sort of geographically in the middle of the South Pacific, but we were regarded as, one of the more successful countries, one of the bigger countries, one of the more stable countries. And so we attracted to Fiji a lot of regional institutions. You think about the Forum Secretariat, we've got a big UN presence here, we've got lots of regional organizations. But the biggest one is USP. And you think about the huge advantages that Fiji has had because it's had the main campus and the headquarters of administration of USP in Suva. We've got the benefit of all that money being spent. We've got the benefit of all the skills that very clever people at USP are able to bring to society. for our own students, instead of flying 1,000 miles and having to live in student accommodation, we've got people who can catch the bus to their studies, to their university studies, and go home every day, all because that campus is here. And what that reflects is that the other countries in the region trusted Fiji. They entrusted USP to Fiji and said, we trust you to do the right thing by this university. And what has happened? Fiji has started to behave really badly. And just because Professor Ahluwalia got up the nose of the current government, the Fiji government has thrown out, the vice chancellor. The Fiji government has withheld money, has applied a lot of pressure on the university. And this is something that the Fiji government should understand. This is not about Fiji. This is about the region. And the Fiji government has a duty of trust to the whole region to treat the university properly. What is going to happen is that, and this has certainly happened over the last 10 years, is Fiji has lost the trust and confidence of its regional neighbors, just in the way it has looked down at its regional neighbors like Vanuatu, like the Solomon Islands. It's treated them with disrespect. And it's treated regional institutions like the Forum with disrespect. And what that means is that Fiji is no longer going to be well regarded by the countries of the region. So, again, for me, that's the bigger point, that Fiji is a trustee of USP. And instead, Fiji has completely abused that trust, all because it doesn't like, or it has had a disagreement with the university administration. And to withhold monies from a regional institution, you have promised that money to the university. You have made a commitment that the university is going to get that money. And now you withhold it because the Minister of Economy is having a hissy fit with the Vice Chancellor and what the Vice Chancellor is doing and saying. It's unprofessional. It's dishonorable that you are not meeting a commitment just because you have a disagreement.
Okay, let me move things along. Still talking about the due process of law, still with Professor Ahluwalia example, television footage, as we saw, showed that the good professor and his wife were unceremoniously bundled and deported in the covert-type middle-of-the-night operation. Now, he still remains the USP Vice Chancellor, working from the USP Samoa campus. My question is, and this is all about the due process of law, whether you think the due process of law was followed in this case relating to the actual deportation.
Well, of course not. I mean, why, when you grant somebody a work permit, and again, Sashi, and I'm sorry to labor the point, right? But USP is special. You grant, it's a bit like, and it's a slightly extreme example, but if you think about the United Nations in New York, New York is an open city for UN diplomats and UN leaders, and even when the US was at war with Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, Gaddafi was allowed to come to New York and address the United Nations. The US did not say, Gaddafi, you can't come here, or Gaddafi, we're going to kick you out, because they respected the fact that they were the hosts of an international organization. So again, I sort of come back to the point. When you grant the Vice Chancellor of a regional organization a work permit, you're doing that as an act of trust because you are the host of a regional organization. So that's the first thing. You've got to respect that that person is doing more than simply working in Fiji. when you grant a person a permit as an expatriate to work in Fiji, there are certain conditions they've got to abide by. They can't involve themselves in domestic politics. They can't commit crimes. They can't do all of those sorts of things. But otherwise, you leave them alone. If somebody is suspected of doing something wrong in breach of their permit, you give them due process, don't you? You
That's
write
right.
to them and you say, listen, this is what you are accused of doing. What is your answer? Because we need to know whether what you've been accused of doing is true or not. What have you got to say for yourself? And you give a person an opportunity to reply, and then you weigh it all up. And you say, okay, well, these are the facts. This is what his accusers say. This is what he says. So let's assume that what his accusers say is true. Is that still grounds for me to end his work permit and kick him out of the country? And if it is, well, fine. Let's give him 2 weeks and say, pack up, you've got to go. But of course, in Fiji, none of that happens. He's simply accused in the middle of the night of having committed some dastardly crime against the government of Fiji. He's given no opportunity to answer. He's given no opportunity to put his point of view. What's the crime that's so bad that he's got to be put on the next plane? Why can't you give him a week to leave the country? Why does everything have to be done in the middle of the night? Is he a terrorist? What sort of threat is he to the people of Fiji that you've got to bundle him out in that fashion? So, at a whole lot of different levels, Sashi, no due process was afforded to him anywhere.
And I find that so strange because I've been practicing migration law for well over 20 years. And even when an adverse decision is handed down and when visas are cancelled, there's a due process. Here in Australia, before the cancellation, there's a notice of intention to cancel, and the person gets 14 days to respond to the reasons. And then there's a notice of cancellation. Following that, there's due process of law of so many avenues of appeal. And I find it so strange that in Professor Aluwalia's example, bundled up in the middle of the night, put on a plane and deported. Hence, I asked you that about the due process. Let's move on.
Yeah, and sorry,
August,
but before we do, right? You and I are lawyers.
Yes.
I don't know. I suspect that I don't know immigration law as well as you do, and the process that is involved, right? But the important thing, it comes back to a point I talked about earlier on, right, is that this ought not to be a conversation about law. This is a conversation about behaving properly and a government behaving in a way that is fair, right? We all know, even when we discipline our children, right? If our children are asked, if our children are accused of something, if the sister says of the brother, he hit me, you ask the brother first, is that true? Did you do that to your sister? It's common sense. You don't act on an accusation without hearing the other side. You don't push people out of the country in the middle of the night without finding out all the facts. So anyway, it's just a point that I want to make, which is that this isn't complex stuff. This isn't legal stuff. Behaving fairly, behaving reasonably is not a complicated thing. It's common sense. And that's how governments, have got to behave. And that's what the people are entitled to expect, that people behave reasonably and fairly when they're in government.
It just seems that some people in power are bereft of common sense. Now, in August 2019, in images sent right around the world by social media, the Prime Minister of the country was seen being physical with a member of the opposition party, the Honorable Pio Tikunduandua. The PM apologized. Honorable Tikunduandua refused to apologize and was suspended from Parliament for 6 months. What was your thoughts in terms of how the Privileges Committee handled that and handed down a 6-month suspension. Now, do you think justice prevailed?
Well, it's actually interesting, and there is a legal aspect to this. Parliament, as you know, regulates its own behavior. So the courts don't get involved in what parliamentarians do. However, the question, so in this particular case, what happened was that the Parliament Privileges Committee said, oh, well, they're both equally at fault. The Prime Minister manhandled Pio, but Pio said bad things about him. So therefore, they've got to apologize to each other. Now, politicians will criticize each other. That's what they do. And so for the Privileges Committee to come up and say, oh, well, manhandling a person is the same as criticizing a person is, ridiculous. And so to say you've both got to apologize because you both did bad things to each other, so just doesn't smack of any sort of fairness to me. But the other point, and I think the point that's been overlooked here, is that the police, on the advice of the Director of Public Prosecutions, decided that it wasn't going to investigate whether or not this was an assault, and whether or not, a person who might have committed an assault, because that person, even if he's the Prime Minister, is just another citizen, whether an investigation ought to take place. And decided, oh, well, this is all because it's all Parliament and the Privileges Committee has ruled on it. Now, the law around the world is that if a criminal offense takes place or is alleged to have taken place, because it's never been proven to a criminal standard of proof that it happened, but if there's an allegation of criminal behavior, such as assault, the police do have the right to investigate that, regardless. You look, for example, in the UK, where we had all of those expenses scandals for members of Parliament years ago, where they were claiming money fraudulently, claiming their parliamentary allowances fraudulently. They were certainly dealt with in Parliament, but the police also investigated that. Some of them were prosecuted and some of them were even jailed, right? So you've got a situation not only where Parliament didn't act in a fair or reasonable way, but other authorities didn't step up to the plate either. So,
okay. Now, carrying on with the theme of the due process of law, we come to the current case, the case of the former Solicitor General, Sharvada Sharma. Now, I know that the matter is presently before the court. However, noting that certain things have been declared in open court and have already been publicized, I would like to address a few things with you. Firstly, there is a due process of law that has to be accorded to dealing with suspensions and terminations of employment. In this case, Mr. Sharma was suspended without pay and then dismissed by the former president. My question is, were the procedural steps followed to accord Mr. Sharma his common law rights to natural justice? And secondly, what about his constitutional rights?
Yeah, so on that one, Sashi, first of all, talking about due process, got to declare my interest because I'm a member of the firm that acts for Mr. Sharma.
Sure.
And that matter is, as you say, before the courts. So I'm going to just duck that question because for some reason, the courts of Fiji have a very highly sensitized viewpoint of the law of sub judice. They seem to believe that you can't say anything about the facts or the law underpinning a case while the case is before the court. I don't agree that that is what the law is, but our courts seem to be very sensitive about that. And so I guess as a lawyer practicing before the Fiji courts, I've got to respect the view that the courts take, even if I disagree with it. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just going to have to.
No,
And of course, even if I expressed a view, you could criticize. Well, listeners could criticize that view as the
okay.
view of somebody with an interest in the case.
I totally accept what you've just said. Your firm is representing Mr. Sharma. Let me try and take another angle, and please feel free to tell me if you can travel via that path or not. I know where you're coming from as a lawyer. I certainly know what you're saying. Focusing on the Prime Minister and the part in the role played by the Prime Minister, where Mr. Sharma gets a directive to go to the PM's office. Once there, the PM apparently says he's heard things about Mr. Sharma. Here's a resignation letter, sign. Mr. Sharma, to his credit, says, well, not really, let me think about that. And in a written letter to the Prime Minister, quite correctly points out that the Judicial Services Commission was the proper authority to consider any complaint and deliberate on his matter. Noting what you've just said, my question is this. Do you believe the Prime Minister overstepped his powers, overstepped the boundary in seeking immediate resignation of Mr. Sharma without the due process of the law being followed? That being, refer the matter to the Judicial Services Commission. Can I,
Yeah.
so can't?
Well, let me answer it this way. I mean, that's part of the fact pattern that's in front of a judge right now. So if I follow my earlier rule, I
Sure.
probably shouldn't comment. But what I can say is this, and I think you've touched on it, right? That under the Constitution, the Solicitor General is treated like a judge. And so the proper process for the Solicitor General to be dealt with, or at least the process under the Constitution, I should say, because that's what the Constitution says, is that if there's any accusation of bad behavior against the Solicitor General, like a judge, that accusation has to be given to the Judicial Services Commission, and the Judicial Services Commission then has to act. And if it believes that there's a case there's a case that has got to be investigated, then it's got to appoint a tribunal. That's what the Constitution says. So I'm going to stop there and let everybody, draw their own conclusion.
All right. Another question on the same topic, but you be cautious, as cautious as you want. Still using that same scenario of Prime Minister Bainimarama, he then phones he goes to the extent of actually phoning the commissioner and informing the commissioner about the suspension.
You mean the chair? You mean the chair of the commission?
The chair of the commission, pardon me. Now, is this another example of the Prime Minister overstepping his boundary, the separation of powers, so to say? Do you think he's in breach given the obligations to adhere to the universal principles of judicial independence?
Yeah. So I am going to duck that question, not so much because I don't have a view about what the Prime Minister did, but obviously it's a live issue about what the person at the other end of the phone call did or should have done, right? And I think that's probably a question that's in front of the court right now.
I think, with all due respect to you, I'll leave these series of questions and we'll move on to other things. You're watching Sashi Singh's Talking Point, the Thinking People's program. My chief guest this afternoon is Mr. Richard Naidu. And as I say, we ask the questions that Fijians want answers to. Richard, let's go to section 131.2 of the Constitution, which states, and I'll read this, "It shall be the overall responsibility of the Republic of Fiji military forces to ensure at all times the security, defense, and well-being of Fiji and all Fijians. I can understand that a military force is established to ensure the security and defense of a country against outside forces to protect its borders, so to say. But in this instance, may I please first of all ask you to define what is meant by the words well-being?
Well, that's going to depend on what anybody who tries to use the clause is going to interpret it at. I mean, who knows what the word well-being means in that context? That's going to be a matter for lawyers and judges if we ever reach that situation, because like everything in the law, you can look at a particular word, but how that word is applied depends very much on the facts that are in front of you. Because you're going to be saying, right, well, in this is what has occurred, A, B, and C. Is this a situation that is detrimental to the well-being of the country? So, the clause is controversial enough already. So what the word well-being means, who knows, really? We won't
Okay.
really know until we have a set of facts and a judge has to decide.
Ambiguity at its best, I guess. Now, the well-being of all Fijians, is this the role of the military, or should this be the role of an elected government to pass laws to ensure the well-being of its citizens?
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
So I think this particular clause has come and gone in Fiji constitutions. So we all understand we've had 4 constitutions since 1970. And so we had the 1970 constitution, and then we had the 1990
97?
constitution, then the 97 one, which really amended the 1991, and then the 2013 one. And so when you look at a clause like this, it depends very much on who's arguing the case. So the people who don't like it are going to say, this is a license, a legal license given to the military to stage a coup. This is making a coup lawful because the military could say, the well-being of Fiji requires that I get rid of this government. And so that's what the people who disagree with the clause say it means. The people who support the clause say, no, it's not meant to be anything like that. It's simply a way of, defining what the military's job is. So if we look at the 1970 Constitution, there wasn't a clause like that. In the 1990 Constitution, there was. And then in the 1997 Constitution, it came out. And now in the 2013 Constitution, it's back. So I guess I would take my cue from what happened in 1997, because that was a constitution that was designed very carefully by constitutional scholars who drafted it, did a lot of work on it, and of course, it was voted in by Parliament. So I think I would take my guidance from the fact that in 1997, that clause was not there. And so my view is, that the better view from the people who are the experts is that that sort of clause should not be there.
Noting that the clause is there, and let's hypothetically look at a situation which may become a reality. Following the next elections, if there is a change in government, using that same clause, the well-being of Fiji and the well-being of Fijians, can there be a situation where the army can once again take over, a coup?
Well, I think the answer to that, first of all, is that what is a constitution really? It's just a piece of paper. It's just a piece of paper. And what we know is that in the last 50 years, we have torn up that piece of paper how many times? We've abrogated the 70 Constitution, we've abrogated the 1997 the 1997 Constitution. So we've torn it up at least twice.
And burnt one.
And burnt. Well, I think we burnt the draft.
Yes,
so my point is only this. It's really only a piece of paper. And that's what rule of law ultimately depends on, right? It depends on us all agreeing to accept that piece of paper is important, and we are going to show respect to it. Now, your question is, if after the election the current government did not win,
yes,
and the current government asked the military to step back in and put it in place, whether that would be lawful. So I think there's a whole lot of ways that you can break that down. That's assuming that the military would accept that instruction or that request. And I'm certainly hoping that the military would not. If it were to occur, then it may be in a situation where nobody's paying any respect to any constitution anyway, right? It's just force of arms. But I suppose to say, well, we did it to justify the well-being. We did it for the well-being of the country. But that would mean you'd have to take that to a judge who might say, yes, I agree with you, or no, I disagree. And, in those very hot situations, it's not always the case that, courts have a say.
All right. Let's leave that one there. Now, if I looked at the provisions of Section 154 of the Constitution that deals with emergency powers, and if I may read Section 154, one states, the Prime Minister may, on the recommendation of the Commissioner of Police and the Commander of the Republic of the Fiji Military Forces, declare a state of emergency in Fiji or in a part of Fiji, and may make regulations relating to a state of emergency if there are reasonable grounds to believe that A, the security and safety of all or part of Fiji is threatened, and B, it is necessary to declare a state of emergency to deal effectively with the threatening circumstances. Now, I'm sure that if the average Joe on the street was asked about this provision, he would say that the provision referred to perhaps an outside threat. My question is, what's your view on Section 154.1? Can it be used for internal strife?
Oh, I think it can be used for internal strife, for sure. I mean, and those sorts of emergency powers are normal, for any government. I mean, if the country is in flames and people are rioting and there's civil disturbance and things are out of control, even if that's internal, I think it's fair for a government to have emergency powers. But from memory, Sashi, I think if you go on under Section 154, those emergency powers require Parliament to be called. So if Parliament is sitting, I think
You're right. Yes.
Parliament's got to be called to approve the declaration of the state of emergency. And if Parliament's not sitting, I think it's got to be called in a week or 2 weeks or something like that.
That's
and
right.
So that emergency provision itself, as it sits on the page, is probably not unreasonable. If there's a genuine situation of strife where things are exploding in the country and all hell is breaking loose, it's always the right of the government to declare a state of emergency. But our emergency rules say, but you must then call Parliament, and Parliament's got to approve it. Now,
Right.
of course, our Parliament right now, that's another story. But at least you have that mechanism there, that.
Okay. All right. Now, you touched on, we discussed a bit on corruption. The public perception is that corruption and nepotism is rife in the government. We have a number of cases of preferential type of treatment that have been displayed quite openly. An example of this is the current Commissioner of Prisons. I understand that even when he was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced, he was still receiving full pay. Another example is that of a businessman running a business while officially being a prisoner. Do these examples suggest that there is a selective justice system in play here?
I don't know the facts of either of those cases, right? So I think, certainly an odd situation that we have a commissioner of prisons who has been on the other side of the bars. Whether that amounts to corruption or nepotism, the laws of libel mean that I've got to be careful about what I say there. I don't know the facts of what you said, for example, whether he was receiving full pay while he was in prison or not. I know there was an accusation of that. I'm not sure if that's actually true. So the other situation where a businessman in prison, did you say, was running a business?
Yes. Well, I mean,
I don't really know much about that either.
Okay, we can leave that. What do you think? Do you think the public perception that corruption is rife in government carries weight?
Well, I talked about corruption earlier on, and in which I said that while there's certainly corruption around, Fiji is not squeaky clean. I'm not sure, in terms of the corruption that most of us think about, which is taking bribes, putting $20,000 into a brown bag in order to get a favorable decision. Can I say that Fiji is squeaky clean? Of course not. We don't know. We just don't have enough facts around that, right? But I think people have got to be encouraged to think about corruption and abuse of power in a broader sense than that. And what's the usual definition of corruption? It's abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. So in other words, if you are a public official, you're in a position of trust. You are exercising powers not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of others. And so if you make decisions because you're motivated by factors that are incorrect or malicious or that profit yourself, then you're not performing a public service. You've breached your trust. And so think about someone like the former Prime Minister of Israel, Jonathan Netanyahu. And one of the things for which he's currently being prosecuted for corruption is that he allowed government resources to go to certain media organizations in return for favorable coverage of his government and his party from those media organizations. And in Israel, that was regarded as corruption. So I'm just going to leave that little thought there.
Good. All right. Let me now move our discussion to what I term perhaps another major stuff up. And that was the appointment of the chairperson of the Fijian Electoral Commission, Mr. Suresh Chandra, who was appointed to the position in February of 2017. For 4 long years, he was the chairperson. It took 3 political party leaders to formally write to the Constitutional Officers Commission to call for his removal. The party leaders alleged that the chairperson did not hold a current practicing certificate as a lawyer. And now, if you and I didn't have a practicing certificate, we definitely will not be allowed to practice law. Where do you think the finger of blame should go to in this stuff up? Somebody didn't tick all the boxes, didn't do the checks and balances?
Well, Sashi, let me put a slightly different spin on that. Strictly speaking, and actually before I go on, I have a feeling that although I'm not personally involved, my firm might be personally involved in something in the fact pattern
Okay.
concerning Mr. Chandra's difficulties, right? But strictly speaking, the person who holds the chair of the Electoral Commission, from memory, is required to have the qualifications that are needed for a judge.
You're right. Yes.
And I think from memory, that's 7 years post legal, or might be post 10 years post qualification experience. And Mr. Chandra obviously has the 10 years. And whether he was required to be a practicing lawyer, to actually have a practicing certificate, I think, strictly speaking, is a different issue. Because what the Constitution requires is that the chair of the Electoral Commission must be qualified to be a judge. Doesn't actually require him or her to be a practicing lawyer.
Okay.
So I think the question that he didn't have a practicing certificate was not necessarily relevant. Now, it's a matter of public knowledge that he had difficulties with his trust account.
Yes.
And so whether that was something that ought to have gone to the question of whether or not he should stay in that position or not, that's a different question. And some people might say, well, he shouldn't have been holding his position if that was true. But I think if we look, technically at whether or not he was disqualified, and I know that's not a viewpoint you might expect me to hold, but I think if you look technically at it, I don't think he was required to have a practicing certificate to hold down the job.
Okay, I'll check my facts on that. I'll definitely
no,
check
I
my
don't think your
on that.
facts are wrong. Your facts are not wrong, Sashi, right? The facts are that he did not have a practicing certificate. That is so. But whether that disentitled him to be chair of the Electoral Commission, that's the question.
Sure, I take that. And then obviously, as you said, it's public knowledge about the trust account funds. And my thoughts are that someone ought to have carried out a fit and proper person test, as lawyers normally go through.
And I think that's a legitimate point of view. That's a legitimate point of view. But I think in terms of meeting the technical qualifications, I don't think he was, out of. I don't think he was actually disqualified.
Point taken. Now, I'd like to move our discussions to Fiji's parliament. In one of your recent opinion pieces in the Fiji Times, you wrote on, and I quote, a Potemkin parliament. I must say that I thoroughly enjoyed the article, the opinion piece. First of all, please do tell my listeners, what is the Potemkin effect?
It's interesting, because you get feedback on the stuff that you write. And that particular article didn't get much feedback. So obviously I spent too much time talking about Catherine the Great and General Potemkin and didn't really get to the nuts and bolts of why I said it. But there's a well-known phrase called a Potemkin Parliament or a Potemkin village, which is really a village that looks very nice and very pretty and very functional, but really isn't. It's really just a facade. And so I was very critical of our parliament because it just seems to me that it's not functioning the way a proper parliament should function. And I was a bit fed up because, first of all, all of our laws seem to just get rushed through Parliament on 48 hours notice. And this seems to be being permitted by the Speaker and the Business Committee. I'm even more annoyed about the fact that Parliament no longer actually votes. And this may seem strange to everybody, but it's actually a fact. Let's just talk about that for a minute.
Well, let me just throw in another question
Yeah.
whilst you are
Yeah.
at it, and I apologize for interrupting.
That's right.
You just mentioned Parliament, the role of the Speaker. Let's look at Standing Order 51. Let's look at it. It allows Parliament to vote to bypass the usual stages of considering a bill. Now, let me hear your views on Standing Order 51.
Okay, so as you say, Standing Order 51 is the one that says Parliament can change the normal rules that it has for considering bills, legislation. Now let's just talk about legislation. These are laws that affect all of us. When Parliament makes laws, we're all affected by them. There can be laws on taxes, there can be laws on transport, on education, on any number of things. And these affect us, the people. So who ought to make those laws? Well, the representatives of the people ought to make those laws, the parliamentarians. But the parliamentarians ought to be asking the people, before the laws are passed, what do you think? Is this a good law or is this a bad law? Do you agree with it? Do you agree with what the government is saying, or do you disagree with what the government is saying? And if, for example, it's a tax law, or if it's a law that affects business, you ask business people, is this an effective law? And the business people say, no, it's not effective because it doesn't. Why don't you do it a different way? Why don't you do it this way instead of that way? So go back and amend your law, and that will make the law work well for everybody. And, we call that consultation, right? So ordinarily in Parliament, what you expect to happen is that a bill comes in for a first reading, what's called. And then having been read, that's when the bill appears for the first time. And that's when you send it off to a select committee, or you give it to parliamentarians and you say, have a read of this law. Go and consult everybody. Go and consult your supporters and your party members and your people and see what they think about it. And come back to us in a couple of months' time and tell us what you think. Or you give it to one of the select committees of Parliament. We all know these parliamentary select committees go around the country inviting people's opinions on different laws and whether or not these laws work or not. Now, a lot of this law is very complicated and people don't necessarily have views on it, but there are always people affected by laws, and they ought to be able to say, look, this law just doesn't work, or this law is bad for me, or have you thought of this, or have you thought of that, or why don't you do it in a different way? But when you're saying, here is the bill, you've got 2 days to think about it, and then we're all going to vote for it and pass the law, who's got time to do any of that? Who's got time to think about it? Now, in the last Parliament, because the standing orders normally require that 48 hours, 2 days minimum notice is required for parliamentarians to have notice of a bill. In the last Parliament, they didn't even bother with that. They turned up on Wednesday night with 4 new bills and said, guys, we're just debating them in the morning. So nobody has a chance to consult anybody else, to take legal advice. Are these good laws? Are these bad laws? They're just going to be debated and passed straight away.
Now, I was amazed. You just gave that example of 4 bills being brought at night and then expected to be debated the next day. That a government minister actually said that it only takes 5 minutes to read and digest a bill. Now, is this a mockery of the whole parliamentary system? I mean, come on.
Well, I mean, that particular minister is a lawyer. And maybe he thinks he's just a very, very smart lawyer and a very clever lawyer who can read a bill and understand everything about it in 5 minutes. And I have to say, I'm not that smart. I'm just not that clever. Any bill that you read, it's not a matter of reading it. You've got to read it and then say, okay, what was intended here? And if what they intended to do is that actually what's going to happen? Because we all know, well, we certainly as lawyers, we know when we draft contracts and we draft legislation and so on, what you think you're writing is not necessarily what anybody else thinks you're writing. And certainly not what a judge may think you are writing. And so it's really important that you read a bill and you say, well, does that work? Does that do what it's supposed to do? And then you go and ask people who are going to be affected by it, what's your view of this? And you would be amazed. And certainly, Sashi, you will have had this experience as a lawyer drafting a contract and sending it back to the client and saying, what do you think? And the client saying, no, you got that completely wrong because you don't understand my business. You don't understand that when you draft something that says X and Y, it's going to do this to me. So take it back and write it properly this time. And just about all of us as lawyers who've drafted contracts know that. It's no different for a bill, right? So you've got somebody working in government buildings who's writing a law and thinks this is how it's going to work. But they have no idea how it's going to work in real life. And that has been our experience with so many laws passed in a rush by the government. So, what do you do when that is the mentality? And that's the problem. You have people in government who are saying, we know everything. We're smarter than everybody else. So we don't have to consult anybody. And we're more important than the parliamentary system, which is supposed to put that legislation in front of everybody, give everybody a chance to consult, give everybody a chance to have input on the bill, and then bring it back for debate and amendment. But instead, you've got a government that says, we're smarter than everybody. We can read a bill in 5 minutes. We know everything.
Okay, now I'd like to raise the issue of the National Federation Party trying to move a motion in Parliament on the late Professor Bridgelal and his wife's entry ban to be removed. Now, the Speaker of Parliament referred to the separation of powers. Very important, the separation of powers. Firstly, briefly, because I've got a whole lot of questions still left. Firstly, what does the separation of powers mean in this particular example?
Yeah, and I, in this particular example, Sashi, I have no idea what it means, right? Because
It
it's
was
just
confusing.
completely nonsensical. The separation of powers is this very grand phrase that gets wheeled out a lot. And it's supposed to be treated like some sort of sacred rule that you worship. Let's just reduce it to its absolute simple elements, right? The separation of powers means, and those of us who've done a little bit of study of government know that government has three arms. It has the legislature, who is Parliament, the body that makes laws. It has the executive, which is the cabinet and the civil service who carry out those laws. And you have the judiciary. And the judiciary is like the ref. So when the government does something which we the public say is against the law, we're allowed to go and challenge it in court, just like those 7 women in court are doing right now, just like Mr. Sharma is doing in terms of and so you go to the referee, which is the judiciary, and the judiciary says the citizen is right or the government is right, and the other side is wrong. And so that's really, really simply, that's all the separation of powers is. The legislature has power, the executive has power, the judiciary has power. And they're supposed to work in checks and balances. They're supposed to, work against each other so that no one side gets too powerful and dominates. They're supposed to work and balance each other. So that's all separation of powers is.
Okay, now in that particular example, speaking of the late Professor Bridgelal and his wife wanting to bring his ashes home. Now, was that an exercise of what I call politics of pettiness at its best? What would you say?
Well, there you have it, right? And sorry, I probably didn't answer the last question, so I'll try and answer it now. So you've got Parliament saying, oh, no, you can't possibly debate that because that breaches the rule of separation of powers. Okay, so we just talked about what the separation of powers is. So what Parliament seems to be saying now is, oh, well, parliamentarians can't criticize the government. In other words, the government makes a decision that says Professor Bridgelal, his ashes can't be brought in. Well, in fact, that's not fair because the government hasn't made that decision. We've asked the government, or people have asked the government, can the ban be lifted? And government is saying no. And so the NFP goes to Parliament and says, we want Parliament to debate this. We want Parliament to condemn and criticize the government. And Parliament says, oh, no, you can't do that because that breaches the rule of separation of powers. I mean, it's just nonsense. It is Parliament's job to scrutinize the government. It's Parliament's job to debate what the government does and does not do and the actions of the government. So the whole fiasco is just really strange. How can Parliament be saying this?
All right, moving towards the fourth estate, let's look at some issues in terms of media. Given that there is an, I guess, implied or even an ongoing threat of penalties, sanctions, and even jail terms for breaches of the media decree, can Fiji have a truly democratically free media under the current scenario?
Well, I think the short answer is no. We have this media decree that just sits there like a guillotine blade, and it just sits above the heads of every journalist, and you never quite know when that blade is going to fall. So Section 22 of the media decree talks about, and I call it the media decree, because even though we've sanitized all of our laws now, so all of the laws that used to be called decrees, we've now made another law that says all of those decrees are to be called acts. So now you can't actually tell the difference between a military government decree and a law that was passed by Parliament. But I still call it a decree because it's actually a decree. So you have the media decree. And Section 22 says that no newspaper, TV, whatever, may publish or broadcast content, that's news media content, that is, and I think there's 3 rules, that is against public order, that is against the national interest, or that incites racial disharmony. So what is something that is against the national interest? Nobody knows, right? It's the government that's going to decide what content is quote unquote against the national interest. And we never know when the government's going to decide that. Now, the government will tell you, why are you people so worried about it? We've had this law since 2009 and we've never used it. So it's all fine, right? And so, of course, what is the answer to that? Well, if you've never used it, you don't need it. So why don't you get rid of it? But the law just stays there. And it just is, it has this, what they call a chilling effect. Because as a journalist, you never know when that blade is going to fall on you. So the other problem, of course, with media is that if you look at government control of media, and again, you'll see that this is the case not just in Fiji, but in many less democratic countries around the world, including in Africa, where the government doesn't just own radio and TV stations, but it also buys them off with advertising. So it says, you get an exclusive advertising contract. Now, what does that mean? It means that whoever receives that advertising contract is not going to want to upset the government. And so the content of that advertising organization is going to be very, very careful. If not, as happens, in organizations like the Fiji Sun, slavishly pro-government. So there's not just the question of threats against journalists, but there's a question of, when you are owned by the government, and either legally owned by the government or owned by the government because, they own your advertising contract, where is the independence going to come from?
Nicely answered. Yes, because I was going to talk about government and its complicity with certain media organizations uh, for favorable editorial pieces, etc. And I was going to ask about that, and you've just answered that. Now, as the country heads towards the next elections, um, you know, people are saying very, very important elections around the corner. Do you think, given the media decree, as you say, will there be a change of mindset in the Fiji media uh, as the country heads towards the elections? Will there be, for example, investigative journalism to expose the lies or misrepresentations made by any political party to lure voters? A sort of fact checking exercise by journalists.
I don't really think so. I think the media lines are pretty well drawn already. And I think the whole investigative journalism piece is always hard to do. Even in, very well developed countries, investigative journalism is difficult, it's time consuming, it's expensive. And in the mainstream media now, as social media and other forms of media sort of eat away, it's much harder for mainstream media to keep, newsrooms going and keep people, particularly experienced journalists who can do investigative journalism. Also in Fiji, of course, the environment, particularly around government, is not transparent. We don't have an official information act. We can't ask the government to give us information. When we ask them, they never answer. We've talked about Parliament a bit earlier on, Sashi.
Yes.
And it's not just motions that are denied by Parliament, it's also questions. Because when the opposition puts questions into Parliament, a lot of those questions are refused, again, for really bizarre, strange reasons. So many embarrassing questions that the government ought to be facing in Parliament are never heard. So you've got a whole lot of reasons why, I think there's not going to be much change in the media environment between now and the next election.
Okay. Now, respect for human rights is the cornerstone of communities. Human rights recognizes the inherent value of each person, regardless of their background, where they live, what they look like, etc. And they're based on the principles of dignity, equality, mutual respect, shared across cultures, religions, and philosophies. Fiji has a Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission. I seek your views on this body. Firstly, is this body truly independent?
The dear old Human Rights Commission. Where do we start? It's very difficult to see how anybody would believe that it's independent or that it's performing its function. And if anybody doesn't believe me, they can always go back to the views of the UN. There was a UN rapporteur on human rights commissions. He was here a few years ago, and he was pretty scathing about the independence and the behavior of the Fiji Human Rights Commission. So, no, I don't think, I have no time for it. As a lawyer, when I'm faced with a situation where there's been a breach of human rights of a client, which requires some kind of legal solution, it is never my advice to take that to the Human Rights Commission. I mean,
Okay.
so let me just, how I've attempted to answer that is not as an opponent, not as a politician. So what I've tried to say is, well, look at what the UN rapporteur had to say, number one. And number two, as a professional lawyer, if I was advising a client about how to get a legal solution to your problem, the Human Rights Commission is not the place I would go.
Well, the Constitution defines the Commission's purpose as to protect and promote human rights for the people of Fiji and to help build and strengthen a culture of human rights in Fiji. So, what you've just said leads me to conclude that the Commission has not met its objective. Is that correct?
Well, the Constitution says a lot of things.
It does.
The Constitution says a lot of things that don't actually happen, right? And that's part of our problem. I mean, the Human Rights Commission runs around and investigates things and reports on things, but they tend to be things that are politically safe. I think they've got quite a good little number running on albinism, albino people. Well, nobody's really got a fight with albino people. They have they investigate breaches of workers' rights. Well, nobody's really got a fight with that. But when it comes to the government doing something, when the government arrests people for their so-called breaches of the Public Order Act or similar, when it's the government that's doing something, that's when you will find the Human Rights Commission strangely silent. And that's the problem. A good Human Rights Commission's job is to challenge the government, because who else is going to do it?
Well said. It seems that the Commission, at the best of times, is a toothless tiger and perhaps a mouthpiece of the government. Let me now turn our discussion towards the Law Society in Fiji. In the past, as we know, the Fiji Law Society in Fiji, they were very vocal, well respected. Recent times, when one looks at human rights issues, things like judicial independence and other matters where there ought to have been a reaction to some of these matters from the Law Society, it seems that a lot of thought process goes in to determine whether something should be said or not. Do you think the Law Society does enough in the advocacy of these basic human rights, of these rights?
Well, again, I should be careful here because I do advise the Law Society from time to time, right? So
Okay.
I need to say that because otherwise, because people can then judge my answer. I think the Law Society, it does actually speak up, and it has spoken up on a number of different issues in the recent past. It spoke up on Dr. Javier's detention. It spoke up on Mr. Sharma's dismissal. It's spoken up on, getting rid of the assessors and the corruption court and so on. So when you're the Law Society, I think probably you have to balance quite carefully what you do and say, because you've got to confine it to what is you've got to talk about the law, opposed to what might be politically unpopular or popular. So, as I say, and declaring my interest there, because I do give advice to the Law Society from time to time, I think the Law Society has been quite measured and careful. And I think probably the Law Society also understands that if it speaks up too often, it loses its impact. So it's more important for it to speak up on the things that are the most important, so that people do realize, what the Law Society thinks is important.
I think you've summed it up. It's a measured approach taken by the Law Society. Now, a couple of questions that have come in, and there's other questions as well. This is in terms of Munro Lees, your company. You're a partner in that company, well-established law firm that goes back in time. Now, I believe you've come under attack from the Attorney General for aligning with the NFP and having financial dealings with them. Would you like to comment on this? And I ask this question Because the obvious thing is, as a law firm, you'd represent any number of clients, including political parties. But that was a criticism that arose from the Attorney General. What do you have to say about that?
I'm not aware that he's accused us of having financial dealings with the NFP. I mean, we've worked for the NFP. We've worked, as you say, Sashi, we've worked for, over the years, we have worked for virtually every political party, actually. And some of those have been cases where we are paid to take a brief. So, for example, for electoral petitions, I know in past years we acted for, I think, Sodelpa, and those were paid briefs. In other cases, we have taken on issues for political parties on a pro bono basis, where we've acted for free because we think, not because we support this political party or that political party, but because we think there's an important public issue at stake, and we ought to, as lawyers, step up and do that work for nothing because there's an important public issue. So as far as our financial dealings are concerned, I think possibly we have acted on the instructions of NFP and they've paid us a fee from time to time. But I think if he's accusing us of some dark financial conspiracy, it's just not true.
Okay. Now, inside Parliament, there has allegedly been mention of your firm that in the past, as you say, that the firm has benefited from previous governments taking contracts, whatever it is, and that the criticism is that now you've lost government contracts, etc., and that your criticism of the current government is because you've lost these contracts, these big fees. That is the comment. Any comments on that?
Yeah. So let me tell you about the myth of working for government and for government bodies, because the accusation is, oh, Manolise, you've made so much money working from the government, and now we've taken that work away from you. You hate us. I mean, let me tell you a little secret. I think since we stopped working for the government, our income's actually gone up.
Yes.
The working for government is challenging in many ways, and we used to work for the government because the work was interesting. You don't make money working for the government. Everything you do requires 3 quotes, and you're always competing against other law firms. And if you really want the work, you've got to lower your fees, and then they take forever to pay you. Working for government was never a particularly lucrative thing to do. It's always better, if you want to make money, to work for big private corporations. And so the sort of work that we actually did for the government tended to be stuff that we were interested in, where we wanted to help, and where we were charging well below, what we'd charge a private client. So this whole idea that we were making millions and millions of dollars off government is just ridiculous.
All right.
Anybody who works for government knows. Anybody who works on a government contract knows. There's not much money to be made there.
Well, I follow your line of thought, and someone once said to me, a smart lawyer never takes government work because you won't get paid for a few years.
That's right.
Now, Richard, I did mention to you in our lead up to the program that normally this lasts for 2 hours or 2.5 hours. I have about 20 more questions to go. So if it's okay with you, if I may still continue, please.
Sashi, I'm a lawyer. I'm paid to talk. So
all right, great stuff.
If you let me go for 5 hours, I'm sure I can go.
No worries. Look, let me now talk about the Fiji First government. How would you rate the Fiji First government in terms of its achievements since the 2018 elections?
Well, you'd probably accept, and most people who are watching would accept, that I probably don't have an objective opinion of the Fiji First Party or the Fiji First government. I think as a government, in terms of delivering things and achieving things, it's possibly no better or no worse than previous governments for delivery. What distinguishes the Fiji First government from every other government is its relentless propaganda, which is, we've done more than ever before. We've spent more money than ever before. We have the Bainimarama boom. Look at all of these achievements. The fact is that when you are given billions of dollars every year to do things, sure, you're going to achieve some things. But then so did every other government. But it is the way this government goes on about saying, look at us and look at how we've done this and look at how we've done that and isn't it great and we're the greatest that we've ever had, that that is the difference. So it's, in terms of delivery, it builds roads and it builds hospitals and it funds schools and it does all of the stuff that other governments do. But let's now talk about the things that it doesn't do. And as a government, what I think has distinguished the Fiji First government from previous governments is its attempt to control everything, set rules on everything, tell us what we must do and what we must not do, and try and claim the credit for everything. And what that means is that it does not involve participation. It doesn't consult anybody. It doesn't work with anybody. You think about the COVID crisis, you think about natural disasters where, thousands of people have lost their job, have been rendered poverty stricken, overnight. People who weren't fantastically well off previously. And the fact that they have needed support and community organizations have poured in. And I'm not sure, I think you said at the beginning that I was on the board of Friend. So
Yes.
again, declare my interest. And look at how much Friend has done to support people, particularly in the West. And the government simply refuses to work with them. Instead, it wants to compete with them, as if to say, look, we can do more than Friend. We can do more than the NGOs. There's simply no communication. There's no attempt to work together. And what we're doing is we're missing an opportunity here. We're missing the opportunity to bring people together, all to work for the same thing. Now, I'm talking about COVID, I'm talking about natural disasters, and that's just a small piece of the puzzle. We talked about legislation and how laws are made. And the government does not want to consult anybody else on how laws should be made, even though if you consult people, you will make those laws better. And this refusal to consult and this demand that only we must have the power, only we must get the credit for all of the good things that happen. Look at local government, the fact that they will not allow local government elections. Why is that? They won't allow local government elections because as a party, they don't have any roots in the community. They are afraid that if you had local government elections in Ba Town Council or Nosori Town Council or Suva City Council or Lambasa Town Council, they would lose. And they probably would lose because they have no local connections. They simply sit in Suva and hand out money. That's how they get elected. But they don't want to share power. They don't want alternative sources of power. And what does that mean? It means that everything is concentrated in the hands of a few people. It means that we have not actually been able to develop the next generation of leadership. And so nobody else is getting the opportunity to try out, to test leadership skills, to respond to people, to understand what people's problems are. And that's been one of the really destructive things about what the Fiji First government has done, really for as long as it's been in power, whether it's been a military government or otherwise. I'll stop there because I'm sure you've got more questions, but
Yes,
I could
indeed.
say a lot more about that. if I had the time.
You mentioned elections, and perhaps it's a good time for me to move to this question. Looking at the office of the Supervisor of Elections, do you see any conflict of interest in that the Minister for Elections is also the General Secretary of the Fiji First Party?
You would think, wouldn't you, that he would at least try to avoid the perception of conflict of interest. But yeah, it does leave a very strange taste in the mouth, doesn't it?
Is it
That the Minister of Elections is also the secretary of a political party, the ruling one.
Do you have confidence in the office of the Supervisor of Elections?
I knew you'd ask me that question. And my answer might give you a very good idea of Fiji today. I'm not allowed by law to say anything which would undermine confidence in the Fiji Elections Office or the Supervisor of Elections. I'm not allowed to criticize him. That's a new law that the government recently passed.
I'll have to check on
So,
this law.
just to give you an idea of how strange our electoral laws are, I can't actually criticize the Supervisor of Elections and the Electoral Commission because that might be undermining confidence in them. And that's now a crime.
Well, there goes my next question, because if you can't talk on that, I can't ask you about that. All right, well, let's move to another line of question here. A commission of inquiry will be conducted in the office of the Auditor General. In recent times, an Auditor General has been terminated, another has resigned. What does this all suggest to you?
What it suggests to me, and this I think is another problem that lands squarely in the lap of the Fiji First government, is how independent officers, independent institutions are constantly undermined. So we've talked about Parliament. We haven't talked about the Elections Office. And now let's talk about the Auditor General, because his office is what's called a constitutional office. It's one of those institutions that is above politics, is above, what we're calling the executive, the actual government of the day. And so when you are the government, it's your, and let's not forget this, when you're the government, you're like the, what they say, the 800-pound gorilla against everybody else, because you've got all the money, you've got all the power of government, you've got all the public servants, you've got the ability to apply all of the laws. And so the first thing in government that you must do is respect the system that is supposed to be bigger than you. That means respecting Parliament. It means respecting the Constitution and the judicial officers that we've been talking about, like the Solicitor General. And it also means respecting people like the Auditor General, because he's there, he's part of the Constitution, and he's there for a different reason than you. He's there to scrutinize you and criticize you. And for so long as we've been independent, we've had an Auditor General. And if you're the government, you don't like the Auditor General very much, because the Auditor General is telling you everything you did wrong. The Auditor General is telling you where you wasted money, where you misspent money, where you got things wrong, and cost the taxpayers money. Now, if you're the government, you must accept that criticism. And if you are a good government, you should be saying, well, look, we understand we're not perfect. We understand that we're going to get things wrong. And we understand the importance of having somebody like the Auditor General to tell us where we go wrong so we can fix it. But what we've got now is a government that seems to think that the Auditor General ought to be telling it that it's perfect and not criticizing it. So when the Auditor General says some things that the government doesn't like, the government says, oh, the Auditor General's wrong, and so let's have a commission of inquiry into the Auditor General. There's no need for a commission of inquiry into the Auditor General. It's really just to make a debating point. How long since they announced this commission of inquiry? Because as far as I know, this commission of inquiry hasn't met. It certainly hasn't made public any process that it's going to follow. So this seems to me to be just sort of make it up as you go along politics, just because you're upset at something the Auditor General said.
Now, sometimes it seems that Parliament has lost that aura that it possessed in the past. A recent statement by a government minister, for instance, that the Auditor General never says nice things about the government. Hello, what is the Auditor General's job, I ask? I mean, what do you say to such comments being made in Fiji's parliament?
Well, what it goes to show, Sashi, and we just talked about this, is the mindset of this government, right? Which is that people may only say good things about us. If you criticize us, you are a bad person. If you criticize us, you are politically aligned, right? Now, that's what I mean. You've got a government that insists on everybody saying only nice things about it. So it's saying we cannot be criticized because we're perfect. And we're better than any alternative. And anybody who criticizes us, whether it's their job or not, and whether they're paid to or not, they're bad people. So you begin to get an idea of a government that thinks it's better than the system it belongs in. And that's when things get a little bit dangerous and dictatorial. When you think that you're more important than the constitutional system in which you work, when you think that only you have all of the ideas, and when you're the smartest and you're the best, and nobody else ever has a good idea, and anybody who criticizes must be a bad person, that's a sign that you're kind of losing the plot.
Well,
You don't really understand what a government is supposed to be there for.
Doesn't that spell out arrogance? Just simple, plain and simple.
Well,
Not
I
that
think it's
I'm the
arrogance.
smartest. It's absolute bloody arrogance.
Yeah, and you're arrogant, and I mean that's okay. I mean, if it was merely being arrogant, and people accuse me of being arrogant, right? But it's what your arrogance is doing to government and the process of government and the ability of everybody to participate and share in and take part in their government. That's the problem with the arrogance, and that's the problem with saying we're smarter and better than anybody else and nobody ought to criticize us. That's the problem.
Staying with the Auditor General's office, why would the RFMF, I mean, are they above the law in trying to order the Auditor General's office to withdraw the critical report on RFMF financial management?
I'm not even aware of that, Sashi, I must say.
All right.
I don't even know that it happened. Are
All
we
right.
talking about the? I mean, there was an issue many years ago over the regimental fund, but is this a new?
No, even if you take that issue of the regimental fund,
Yeah.
why would the RFMF, I mean, are they above the law, in other words, of trying to get the Auditor General's office to withdraw that report?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about any other one other than the regimental fund, but in the case of the regimental fund, which of course was before this government, the Auditor General demanded to audit the regimental fund. The military said, no, that's not government money, that's soldiers' money. And so it's not within your scope. The Auditor General said, yes, it is, hand it over. And so the Army took the matter to court. And I think the Army, I can't remember if the Army won or lost, but my point is only this, right? The Army did the right thing. The audit, in that case anyway, the Auditor General said, hand over the money. The army said, I don't agree that, so hand over the report. The army said, I don't agree with you. There was a dispute. So the army took the issue to the judiciary. In other words, it took the dispute to the ref, right?
Okay.
That's doing it the right way. That's the separation of powers. That's how it should work. So I'm not aware of any other issue, but you've made me curious now. I'm going to have to go and find out.
All right. Let's look ahead to the forthcoming elections, be it in 2022 or 2023. What is your assessment as the country gets ready for the forthcoming elections? What are your views? What's the buzz on the ground?
I think the government is on the back foot, and even the Fiji Sun polls, surprisingly, say so. And I think, common sense tells you, Sashi, right, that any government certainly in a democratic country, whether Fiji is or not, any government that's been in power for as long as this government has is going to be, people are going to be sick and tired of it. So I would certainly think that fewer than half the population support it now. But until you get to the election, and of course between now and the election, depending on whether the government's going to throw around freebies or try to make itself more popular, with paid Facebook likes or whatever, who knows what's going to happen.
So, which now brings me to the Dihon system of voting. There's been a lot of criticism in terms of the system of voting. What are your views on that?
So I think you have to break that down into two pieces, actually, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first is that the Constitution says that this is how we're going to vote, and it's going to be in direct proportion to the percentage of votes that a party gets, as long as it passes 5%, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a proportional system of representation. Now, I don't think that's a good system, but that's neither here nor there right now. We have those are the rules by which we have to play. Then the question is, okay, if you're going to have a proportional system, what are the systems that are available to you? And I'm not an expert on electoral systems, but this Don system is one of them. And it's one of about 3 or 4, I think, that you can use. And so the Don system, it's mathematically a little bit complicated when you get to the calculation of the last seat and where the last seat falls. And again, I'm not an expert on it, but I think depending on who you talk to, some people would say it favors the biggest party, because in the allocation of those last few votes, it's most likely that the biggest party will get the last seat or last couple of seats. So, for example, I think in the last election, if you look at the maths, NFP that got to almost 8% of the vote on a rounded up basis should have had that 4th seat.
Yes.
But the way the Don system maths worked, that last seat fell to Fiji First.
Fiji First.
I don't think that would always be the case, but if you do the maths, it tends to favor the bigger party.
Now, say if there was a change in government, and say if there was a thought process to change the current electoral system, what would the constitutional requirements be to bring about a change in the electoral system?
Yeah, so with this constitution, we've kind of painted ourselves into a corner, because we've made it a rule that to change even 1 comma in the Constitution. We've got to get a 75% majority in Parliament. And then we've got to go out and have a referendum of all electors.
Mm.
And 75% of all electors have to agree to change the Constitution. And when I say all electors, I don't mean the number who turn up to vote. I mean the number of people who are on the electoral roll. So, for example, on a referendum, because generally speaking, people don't turn up for referendums the way they do for elections.
Sure.
If 80% of the population turned up to vote, 75% out of those 80%, in other words, you'd have to get 75% of all of the number of electors would have to say yes. Now, that's just about impossible to change. And so at some point, we're going to have to confront the practicality of that, because at some point, even this government is going to have to change the Constitution. I mean, constitutions are living things, they're dynamic things, they're supposed to change. And we've painted ourselves into this legal corner a little bit in terms of how to change it. But strictly speaking, I think it will be difficult to change the system. I think the Constitution permits a proportional system. It doesn't actually specify the Don system. So you might be able to say, well, we can use another proportional system inside that framework of the Constitution. But I'm not an expert on that.
One of these days, perhaps I'll invite your colleague, John Apted, to come on the show.
He's the expert.
And talk to us through the quagmire of the current electoral system and other things, all electoral. Richard, if I may now turn my attention to major areas of concerns in Fiji. I mean, look, where does one begin? There's disruptions to the water supplies, interruptions to the electricity supply. The list just goes on and on and on. What do you think are the major areas of concern that the people in Fiji face today?
Certainly sorry, it's just getting a bit dark. It started to rain. I always like that because it looks like I've got a halo.
Yes, it does.
Is that all right? Can you see me a bit better?
Yeah,
Or turn it off. What do you prefer?
I think you turn it off.
Turn it off.
Yeah, let's have a look.
So no halo.
No halo.
No halo. Okay.
Richard Naidu in the flesh without a halo. Yes.
I think if you ask people, certainly the infrastructure, the water, the power, sewage, roads, of course, even though we're supposed to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on roads, people are worried about rising prices, which is effectively an economic problem. Because the problem is not really that prices are rising, because prices rise everywhere. The problem is that incomes are not rising. And if you look at the way the economy has been regulated for the last 10 years, we've kind of tricked ourselves into believing that things are good, because the government has kept some pretty fierce price control on goods. For example, it has actually frozen household rents for 14 years in a row, which is great for people who are renting. But what it means is that people who want to build houses and apartments, to rent to others, are not incentivized to do it because they know that the rent is going to be frozen, right? We've held down electricity costs, we've held down water costs through government action. And so what that means is that prices have not really been allowed to rise to reflect what the market is. And of course, the bigger problem is that incomes are not rising. So when finally we have to accept that prices for fuel will rise, or prices for electricity will rise, or prices for household goods will rise, and of course, like everywhere around the world, inflation has become, a new phenomenon. Once again, after 2 generations, inflation is back. So we're all going to see the consequences of that. So our problem is that in our economy, even before COVID hit, incomes were not rising. So we have to completely re-look at our economy and how it's going to look in the future. And then we've got much bigger issues. We've got huge issues around health. We've got some of the worst NCD problems in the world. Per capita, I think we are the diabetes capital of the world.
Wow.
You look at domestic violence. Again, we have serious rates of domestic violence. And all of these things affect economic productivity. We've got an education system that really has not changed for 30 or 40 years. So we've got a sugar industry. We've got to look at completely rebuilding and reworking. So there are some serious issues that are in front of us. And in many ways, this government has not confronted those issues at all. It simply kicked the can down the road, kept dishing out money, kept saying, look how great we are, but hasn't really focused on any of these intergenerational problems.
Now, is it all doom and gloom, or is there still hope to salvage the situation and to prioritize spending on infrastructure, for example?
Well, the problem we have is that because we have not spent money well in the last 10 years, it's interesting. If you look at the Fiji Times, there's a really interesting graph Professor Waranarsi prepared, and I posted it somewhere on Facebook, showing the average debt that each government has carried. I think right back from the Alliance Party days in the 1970s, how compared to other governments as a percentage of GDP, this government has really piled on the debt. And this is before COVID. This is before all of the recent disasters. And so what the government did was it spent money very freely. It told us it was building infrastructure and roads and water and so on. But we don't know how efficiently it spent the money. As a result of that, when COVID came along and we really did have to spend the money, we had very little money to spend, or we've had to borrow more and more. And so we're now going to see ourselves with a horrendous debt level, 80, 85, 90% of GDP. So what that means is that our ability to spend on these critical things, our roads, our water, our sewage, our wharves, we have serious issue with our wharves and our ports. We just don't have much money to do it. So we've got some serious issues in front of us in terms of how we're going to handle all these things.
A question sent to me earlier in the week from a viewer, question from Roland Lilo from Waiavi in Lautoka, who asks, would the money spent on the military achieve better social and economic returns for Fijians if these huge amounts were spent instead on education, healthcare, housing for the poor, and infrastructure development? And let me add, in the budget estimates for 2021-2022, the RFMF have been allocated a total of something like $79.7 million, and I stand to be corrected on that. But what would you say to Mr. Lilo's question?
So I think, there's a lot of talk about getting rid of the military and we don't need them and so on. I think actually the military does have a role, and like every part of government, if we can use it well and spend money on it well, you think about what roles the military has to play. I mean, for years they have met our international responsibilities, things like peacekeeping. The military is a good employer, and the military gives young people opportunities, particularly when they can travel and do peacekeeping work, that sort of thing, opportunities they wouldn't otherwise get. You think of natural disasters and the way the military can help, disaster preparedness and disaster relief. you think about our international borders, particularly the Navy, and patrolling international waters, fisheries, that kind of thing. So I think the military's got a role. Um, I think the military actually, we could use it a lot more, even in terms of physical fitness, because as I said, we're not a very healthy country, and they could be out there in schools and amongst the community, developing these sorts of things. So I think if we use the military creatively, there's many ways to get our money's worth out of it. So you're always going to be looking at ways in which you can reprioritize money. I do think that there are many ways in which the government works. Haven't changed in 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
We still work with paper files. Whenever I work with a government department and there's something that I'm asking people in headquarters in Suva to do, and it's a problem in the West, everything has to stop until the paper file comes from the office. You want a meeting with a bunch of government officials, you wait for them to travel from the West to Suva for your meeting. This is the era of Zoom and Teams and Google Meet. So there's a whole lot of things that government does really inefficiently, and which cost millions of dollars. We have a government that employs so many people regulating small petty things, when really those same people should be employed doing much more important things. So we've actually got to completely reshift the priorities of our public service and move people out of one inefficient area and into a more efficient one. And I think there's lots of ways in which we can save money if we do that right. But
Okay,
yeah.
I like the way you've described the military and the work that it can do, etc. Now, what would you say to a proposition that perhaps the military's power ought to be removed as a political power broker, and instead that the military should be under the control of its elected politicians, control of its representatives, the parliament?
Well, I mean, I think the military would say that's the position they're in now.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether people agree or disagree with that. And obviously, as I say, we go back to the Constitution as a piece of paper, because that's all it is. And if the only people with guns, who are the military, decide that they're going to tear that up and take power, well, that's all the Constitution ever was, right? It's a piece of paper. But I think in terms of your question, are the military a power broker? They would say, no, we're not. We are just doing our job under the Constitution. Are they a political force? They would say, no, we're not. We're just doing our job under the Constitution. But of course, time will tell, right? As it is told in other times when there have been military coups.
Okay, now, Richard Naidu, looking in your crystal ball, given the current mood in the electorate, what can you foresee in the foreseeable political landscape in Fiji?
Well, obviously we're going to elections. We have got to hope that the elections are free and fair. In the last election, for example, there was that last-minute prosecution of Mr. Rambuka by Faikeng, which seemed very odd timing. So we have to ask ourselves, will there be another sort of shenanigan like that? Because that would suggest to me that this government doesn't intend to run an election in a free and fair way. So that is the real question, I think. It's not so much about whether we'll have an election. It's about whether or not it'll be free and fair. And so that part is important. As I've said, I think politically, the current Fiji First Party is on the back foot in the electorate. And so we're going to have to see if they're going to try to make up that ground, and if they're going to try to make up that ground, how they're going to do it, and whether that'll be fair or whether that's going to involve throwing around money, in order to make itself more popular. Who's to know?
Well, free and fair elections. Did I hear you correctly? And you said that you don't think it's going to be free and fair?
What I'm saying is, that is the big question.
Okay.
Because we know what a free and fair election ought to look like.
Yes.
We know that none of the members of the opposition parties, the leaders of the opposition parties should be interfered with or have their ability to contest an election taken away from them. And so I think there's a few of us cynics around the place who are asking ourselves, is that going to happen? Or is something going to happen that will mean that their rights are interfered with?
It seems that the election campaigning has unofficially started. Given the state of people's plight, do you think that people are really swayed by the freebies handed to them by political parties? Or in the end, particularly this time around, do you think they will choose their representatives with great thought and care?
Who's to know, Sashi? I live my life, or I live my working life, sitting in an air-conditioned office many levels above the ground. I can't pretend to be, I can't pretend to know the mood of the people. But I think in the past, the freebies have had a positive effect for the government. I think probably there's a bit more cynicism about them now, but then you would expect that, because it's like every government, even in a fully democratic country, governments run their course, don't they? I mean,
They
after
do.
15 years, even if you're a reasonably good government, people get sick of you. So I think after 15 years, because if you count the military government, 15, 16 years, that's how long they've been in power, you would expect people to be a bit sick of these people.
Okay, now, will you be contesting the next general elections? Look, let me say this. You may as well announce it here, because things revealed in the SSTP program makes national news headlines for some media organizations in Fiji. So you may as well say it here. Richard Naidu, I'm asking you, will you be contesting the next general elections?
Look, I haven't ruled it out, Sashi.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a feeling that some of my friends in the NFP might shame me into it.
Mm-hmm.
I like my life right now. And I make a decent amount of money. I have my privacy. I can travel. I can go for my runs along the seawall, training to beat mushroom. And the thought of all of those things kind of, going away. I've and how opposition politicians in particular, how hard this government makes life for them. And for everybody out there, who criticizes opposition politicians for not doing enough or for being ineffective, I think it's really important that people understand just how challenging the government makes their lives. They're under threat of arrest. They are not given the resources they need to do research or to get decent support. They're ridiculed. They're not given an opportunity to look at laws. We've talked about that. They're not allowed to ask the questions they want to ask in Parliament, move the motions they want to ask. So, all of that is, I take my hat off to the people in opposition for having endured all of that. And so, coming back to your question, for me, making that decision is a pretty big one.
All right. And that decision, obviously, you need to factor in your service to the nation, the pros as to what if you decide not to contest. But I'll leave that with you for now. What are your views on the People's Alliance Party and the National Federation Party post-election coalition?
Well, in what way? Do I think it would be a good government, do you mean? Or?
Well, yeah, your views. I mean, it's been expressed that there will be a coalition. And do you think it's, as you say, do you think it's going to be a good government or a good partnership?
I think if they succeeded and they got the numbers, I think there are some very good people in there. And I think there are some very good people who are yet to be announced, who will be, in that government. And I could see, I could see a very credible government being put together by those two parties.
So it seems that you have knowledge of the inner sanctum of the workings of the parties. And so to my previous question, whether Richard Naidu is contesting or not, I would say that's a tacit yes, but let's leave it for your formal announcement. That's only my view, Richard. Now, another question, as we're coming towards the end of the program, someone sent this question through. Are you being groomed as a future leader of a political party, such as the National Federation Party?
I can give you a very clear answer to that question. The answer is no. Leading a political party has a special skill of its own. And I think that's not anything that my skills really lend themselves to. I kind of belong in the area of law and policy and technical stuff. I think the political skill that you need to be a leader is it's a separate skill. I mean, if you're talking about NFP, I mean, you look at people like, you look at their three MPs. You look at Biman, you look at Lenora, you look at Peel. I think they are all people who have that skill. I think the people who are in NFP are there because of Professor Biman. I think he's, very strongly supported for leadership in the party. And I take my hat off to him for, he's somebody who could be earning $250,000 salary as a professor in Fiji anywhere. And yet he chooses to be an ordinary opposition backbencher, earning $50,000 a year, putting up with all kinds of nonsense from the government. And that's why I say, I think if anything, it's those three who would shame me into politics, because I really, it's those three, I guess, who I know the best. But all three of them, I think, have made huge sacrifices to be in the positions that they're in. And I have a lot of admiration for them.
You've summed that up very nicely because, as we know, Professor Biman has made huge financial sacrifices to be the leader of the National Federation Party and to take seat in the current parliament under the current conditions. Now, what is your vision or hope for Fiji?
Well, how long have I got? I think if I, let's sort of end, I guess, the way I began, right? Which is that as a young person, I was able to experience life in, first world countries, in the UK, in Europe, and to see how people's potential can be realized. And I think the thing that is frustrating for me, the thing that drives me, is looking around at Fiji. And Fiji is no different from any other place in this sense, but it's our country, right? And you look at the potential of people, and you look at how much we should be able to do to realize the potential of people. And what we're missing in Fiji right now is the ability to work together to solve our problems. Right now, we're a country which is being dictated to by a government that just treats us all as though we're units of humanity who are to be just pushed around and regulated. Whereas what we really should be is a group of people, a nation working together, bringing all of our strengths together and participating. And we're just missing that. We're missing the opportunity to all work together, bring all of our strengths together, bring all of our skills together, and make the country better and make it look like what we want it to look like. I think, Fiji's got huge economic opportunities. And ironically, in the 21st century, smallness is no longer a problem. Smallness and isolation can actually be a strength. As an economic, as a generator of economic activity. I think in the past, if you look at the rule of law situation that we've had, you look at things like the freedom of the press, you look at the institutional strength that we've had. These things are not new to us. We have actually done better in the past. So that's why I'm quite optimistic that we can actually be a successful, well-governed country where we all participate. It's never going to be perfect because no country is ever perfect. But I do actually think that, if you talk about a vision, I'm not very good about talking about these sort of broad things, but I do think we can all have a country in which we can all participate and shape the country the way we want to shape it. I think we can have a good economic future. And I think, the glue that's going to keep that together is to have a well-governed country where we have a good system of governance, and we respect that system of governance, and we all work within it. And those are some of the things I think that are lacking right now.
Very, very nicely answered, I must say. And my final question to you is it time for a change in Fiji?
I think it's been time for a change for a very long time. I think really this government it ran its course a long time ago. And in many ways, we are now going backwards. And certainly from the viewpoint of good governance and keeping our country and our governance together, we are going backwards. And if you look around the world, if you look at history, everything in the end depends on those things, depends on good governance, depends on rule of law. You can't have economic development without it. You can't have peace and stability without it. This whole concept of good governance, all of the talking heads and all of the development economists and all of the constitutional experts all talk about good governance. And we don't have good governance. We are now going backwards. And if we don't fix it, if we don't fix that, we are heading for serious problems down the line. And I do not think the current government is capable of fixing it. I think they've simply lost their way. And it is time for them to go and for there to be a fresh set of eyes on all of our national problems.
I told you a little lie. I said that was the final question. My final question to you is now, any closing remarks from you to our viewers today?
No, I think that was probably the way I was. When you said that was your last question, I kind of tried to frame comment in that way. But I think we've got to stop looking at this in terms of economic growth here or a road there or Walesi everywhere, if it's anywhere. We actually have to stop and think about the whole picture. And it's not about the economy here or COVID there. It's about how we all work together. Because if we're not thinking about that, if we're not able to work, if nothing else is going to work.
All right, Mr. Richard Naidu, lawyer extraordinaire, thank you very, very much for being chief guest in Sashi Singh's Talking Point this afternoon. I appreciate your time, Richard, time you've taken to discuss in a very forthright manner a number of constitutional matters, as well as discussions on things to do with Fiji. May I take this opportunity in extending an open invitation to you to appear in this program at a time in the future, once you announce your candidacy, and or if you'd like to make comments on social issues in Fiji. So once again, thank you very, very much, Richard.
Thank you, Sashi. I've had fun. I didn't think I would, but I've had fun.
Well, it's been, to me, it was a very intellectual discussion, and I think we touched on a number of points. Talking to you, I could be doing this for 5 hours easy, but I've got to let you go, and we'll leave this for another opportunity on another day.
All right. Thank you, Sashi.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Now, folks, don't go away because very, very shortly, I'm going to be revealing our guest for next week. So, look, thank you very much once again, and Vinaka Vakalevu to Richard, and wishing you a blessed Sunday. Please thank your dear family members from my side for stealing you away this afternoon, and have a family fun day, what's left of it. So, folks, at this juncture, let me say to you that I will not give relevance to anyone who believes that they are over and beyond the reach of the SSTP program. People have asked me whether I've invited the government. Well, let me say it for the final time. I have invited the government from day one of my program. So, look, we've had great guests like Mr. Richard Naidu. We've had a number of guests in the last 10 episodes. We will continue to do what we do best as long as people want to talk to us. And the platform is there. And I've seen a number of comments coming through that Vatis is in action today, Vatis or Fatis or whatever you are. Look, your comments don't hurt me. And all we need to do is bring the truth to the people of Fiji to take issues and address them and get answers across this platform. So, look, thank you very much for all your support. And my focus, as I said, is to provide this platform to as many people as possible as I can. The movers, shakers, educators, policymakers, doctors, all sorts of people can contribute to a better Fiji. And here in Sashi Singh's Talking Point, we seek the truth. Well, that's all for episode 10 for this week. A big thank you to my regular contributor, Nikhil Singh, for his input in the program today. To my technical producer, Vince Shandel, a very big thank you as well. And I'm also, I'd also like to thank you, our viewers. But next week, our chief guest on Sashi Singh's Talking Point will be Ms. Shamima Ali, Fiji Women's Crisis Center Coordinator, a session that I'm really looking forward to. And if you have questions that you'd like me to address with Shamima, you can message me on the SSTP page, or those of you who have my Facebook contact on that Facebook page. So next week, it is our session with Ms. Shamima Ali in episode 10. So once again, thank you. And before I leave, I'll leave you with this quote from Aung San Suu Kyi, who said, "The only real prison is fear, and the only real freedom is freedom from fear." I'll repeat that. The only real prison is fear, and the only real freedom is freedom from fear. Look, thank you very much once again. All of you have a blessed Sunday. Thank you. I am Sashi Singh bidding you goodbye, namaste, and ni samove.